The last allocation program I'll talk about, and it was new in 2014, was an allocation program by the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. It allocates the 2C separately, 2C and 3A combined catch limit. The Commission sets a catch limit which is for the commercial and sport users. It includes the landings as well as the incidental mortality in both fisheries. The 2C catch was 3% over the catch limit, and the 3A catch was 5% over the catch limit, and I'll talk a little bit about those later. Starting in the south, off Washington, Oregon, and California, there are 4 commercial fisheries. The first one's a directed fishery that is 10-hour fisheries. We set every 2 weeks there's a 10-hour fishery. It starts on June 25th, and we had 2 this year. The catch was 4,000 pounds under the catch limit. The catch sharing plan allows that 4,000 to be rolled into the incidental halibut fishery during the salmon troll season. This fishery opened on April 1st. There are a lot of different management decisions that happened this year trying to stretch the season out. The first of all, the ratio was 1 halibut to 4 Chinook plus 1 extra halibut. This changed to 1 halibut per trip on May 30th and changed again on July 25th back to the 1 in 4. And as you can see from the PowerPoint, there were quite a few, 4 different trip limits for that fishery, which means the number of fish per trip. The catch in the end closed on September, or the fishery closed on September 11th, 1% over the catch limit. The third commercial fishery in this area is an incidental halibut fishery during the sablefish season, and this happens north of Point Chehalis. The ratio is 75 pounds to 1,000 pounds of sablefish plus 2 extra fish. The same ratio as in 2013, and a little less restrictive than in 2012, where it was 50 pounds per 1,000. And the catch was 15% under the catch limit, which was closer than it had been the previous year. The previous year it was 30% under. The last fishery in this area, the last commercial fishery in this area is the the Treaty Indian fishery. There were an unrestricted fishery, which was 48 hours starting on March 11. There were 2 restricted fisheries where they have a fishing period limit. One had a 400-pound limit, one had a 500-pound limit, and the last fishery on May 8th, which was a 10-hour fishery, and it closed with 1% over the catch limit. I was just going to mention that in Area 2B there's a groundfish integrated fisheries management plan. It has been in place since 2006. Last year was the first year that we were able to use this data to do our estimate of sublegal fish. There's a direct, we can use a direct estimate to account for the discards in this fishery, so we were able to use this for our wastage calculations. And this fishery is electronic monitored. Their data, it has a logbook program, and they're accountable for all their catch and their discards. There are quota share fisheries in Alaska and British Columbia, and the quota share fisheries opened on March 8th. The range has been anywhere from February 28th to March 23rd. And the catches relative to the catch limits, we were 1% under in 2C and 3B, 2% under in 2B, 3% under in 4A and 4CDE, and 4% under in 4B. The one area that we were over the Commission set catch limit was Area 3A, but we were under the adjusted catch limit when you're taking into consideration the underage and overage programs. We were quite close to the catch limits in all areas. In 2013, we were 16% under in 4B and 7% under in 4A, so these catches were all very close to the catch limits. Moving on to the sport fishery, we first started accounting for the sport fishery in 1977. It increased to the amounts in the early 2004 through 2008. The sport fishery was 9 to 10 million pounds. It's been decreasing because of management measures in the last 6 years. The 2014 was 6.89 million pounds, slightly lower than the 2013, but very similar to the 2012 amount. In Area 2A, which is Washington, Oregon, and California, part of the catch-ring plan, it divides this area into 7 areas, 7 sub-areas. And 2014, there was a new sub-area where they divided the southern area at the California border. So the new area was off California. It hasn't had closures before. This past year, it was the sport fishery was closed in August. And all other areas, except for, I guess, Puget Sound, there are 2 areas without in-season management, the California area and the Puget Sound area. All other areas have in-season management. The Columbia River area was, the harvest was 2/3 of the allocation. A lot of these fisheries are relative to other fisheries. If the salmon fisheries and tuna fisheries are good, then people don't go halibut fishing as much. And the catch was 2% under the allocation. Moving on to Area 2B, the initial allocation was 1.075 million pounds. This was the 15% of the Commission set catch limit. The Commission's estimate, which we DFO provided at the end of August, and we estimated by the end of the year 0.915 million pounds would be landed. This is, I think, 13% under the allocation. This year we received landings from Washington Department of Fisheries of the sport fishery that were caught in BC and landed in Washington. So this was reported by Washington Department of Fisheries. We are working with DFO to see if this is already included in this number. As I mentioned, we hadn't received a incidental mortality from the sport fishery from Department of Fisheries and Oceans, so we needed this for stock assessment. So for this year, we used an estimated based on Area 2C data, and we took the ratio of the incidental mortality in Area 2C over the 2C landings and multiplied that by the total landings in Area 2B, and we came up with 34,000 pounds. To meet the allocation, Department of Fisheries and Oceans put different management measures in place. The fishery opened on February 1st, and the management measures in place that went through March 31st were the same as in 2013, which was a 1 fish daily bag limit, a maximum size of 126 centimeters, and there are 2 fish possession limit. One fish had to be less than 83 centimeters. April 1st, they relaxed the management measures slightly. They increased the maximum size to 133 centimeters, and the one fish could be a little bit bigger, less than 90 centimeters. September 1st, the regulations stayed in place, but they allowed a 2 fish bag limit. And in addition to this, there was an annual limit of 6 fish. Also, they have a plan where sport fishers can acquire quota. It's a leasing program so that they can, sport fishers can acquire commercial quota and fish under that program. Alaska, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game tracked the sport fishery in Alaska, and they provided us with final numbers of 6.1 million pounds for 2013. 2014 projection is 5.6 million pounds. They have different estimate methods depending on the fishery. With a charter fishery with the catch-ring plan, they use their mandatory logbook program to get numbers of fish. Everywhere else, they use a statewide harvest. And they also have a krill sampling program to get the average weight. As I mentioned, there's a catch-ring plan, and similar to BC, there's a program where sport anglers under the catch-ring plan can acquire commercial quota to go sport fishing. So how did the catch relative to the allocation, how did it turn out? In Area 2C, the harvest was 0.86 million pounds over the 0.76 million pounds allocation. There was a 1 fish daily bag limit, a reverse slot limit, which means that the fish needed to be 44 centimeters or less, or 76 centimeters or inches. Now we're back to inches. This is the U.S. Okay, sorry. So the reverse slot limit for the Alaska fishery is 44 inches. So the fish has to be 44 inches or less, or 76 inches or greater. And the harvest they saw there were 22% more fish caught, with the average pound that was less than last year. Private anglers, there are no additional restrictions. They have a 2 fish daily bag limit, and they caught 18% fewer fish with a similar average weight. Overall, Southeast, the total sport catch was 9% less than last year. Area 3A, the catch was 2.18 million pounds over the 1.78 million pound allocation, but lower than the 2013 harvest, which was 2.5 million pounds. They caught 8.6% fewer fish. The management measures that were in place were 2 fish daily bag limit and a maximum size of 19 inches for the second fish. In addition, the charter vessels could only do one fishing trip a day. The private anglers, there were no additional management measures, and their harvest was similar to the previous year. So the last removal I'll briefly talk about is the bycatch mortality. And this is a graph that shows you since 1962. The green is area 4, the yellow is area 3, and the blue is area 2. As you can see, there was the lowest bycatch was in the late 1980s. We had hit a peak of over 20 million pounds in the early 90s, and since then it's been decreasing. Just briefly about what's going on in each area. In Area 2A, there's been a IBQ, or individual bycatch quotas, were implemented in 2010. Pre-implementation, the bycatch in this area was 500,000 pounds, and the last year that we've had an estimate, which 2013, was 67,000 pounds. Area 2B, there's been an individual bycatch quota for about 19 years, but the last 10 years the bycatch mortality was 0.18 to 0.35 million pounds. Previously to the implementation of the IBQs, it was over 1 million pounds. The 2014 estimate is 0.24 million pounds. And lastly, bycatch in Alaska 10 years ago was about 13 million pounds, and for the last 4 years it's been 8 to 9 million pounds. We did receive, since the Blue Book was printed, we did receive a new estimate from National Marine Fisheries Service, and they estimate that for 2014 it was 8.9 million pounds, 1% increase from 2013. The increases were in Area 3, and we saw decreases in Area 4. That's it for total removals.
Thanks very much, Heather. And Ray, you're going to give the survey expansion, I think, yeah?
Good afternoon. I'll be talking about a proposal for a satellite survey expansion, which we plan to conduct over the next 5 to 6 years. We'll be reviewing the rationale for that expansion, the motivation behind it, some results from the first year of the expansion, which was conducted in 2014. Also, we're looking briefly at some complementary survey data, which we may be able to use for regions which are not surveyed by the satellite survey every year. So this is a sort of snapshot of what we're planning and what we're doing currently. This is the entire management region of the IPHC, and the black dots represent the standard satellite survey grid that's done on an annual basis. The pink dots represent the proposed expansion stations. And as I mentioned, we're not planning to do all of this at once. It's quite an ambitious undertaking, and this will be rolled out over a 6-year period, beginning last year. You can see there's some substantial gaps in our current coverage of the survey. Some of these represent deep and shallow waters that are not covered by the current satellite survey design. Others, for example, in area 4A, 4B, and 4D, represent gaps within the 20 to 275 nautical mile range of the current survey, which for whatever reason in the past when the survey was designed, stations were not included in those regions. So in summary, we're proposing an expansion of the satellite survey over a 6-year period. First year was last year. we're proposing to expand to deep and shallow waters and to unsurveyed gaps in the current survey range. The goal is to reduce bias in the current abundance indices and in the apportionment process for which the survey data are also used. We also want to improve the quality of the length and age data used in the stock assessment. We're projecting that costs will be between 5 and 12% higher each year of the survey that we do in expansion. That will be partially offset by revenue from additional fish sales from those expanded regions. So the rationale for the expansion. The survey has substantial gaps in coverage, some areas more than others. We have currently no standard deep or shallow stations as part of our standard setline survey grid. And shallow means shallower than 20 fathoms, and deeper means deeper than 275 fathoms. So the standard depth range is 20 to 275 fathoms for the survey that was originally designed and first put into place in 1998. And we also have large gaps in coverage, as I mentioned, particularly in Area 4, within that standard depth range. And of particular relevance for this year, we have had no coverage in the Eastern Bering Sea since 2006 when we did a one-off survey there. And that survey is currently calibrated with a survey that NIMS conduct a troll survey, which is an annual survey run since 1982. And that provides us with a time series for that area. But that calibration was done in 2006. And so those data are now fading into the mists of time, and it's time for an update. So there's potential for bias in our weight per unit effort indices and in the apportionment process, which relies on those indices. The reason is that we're applying the average weight per unit effort in unsurveyed regions to the regions that we're applying the average weight per unit effort from surveyed regions also to the unsurveyed regions. So we're making the assumption about that the density in those regions, even though they may have quite different characteristics because they're deeper or shallower or they're distinct from the areas we're surveying, we're assuming that that's the same as the regions that we're currently surveying. And past expansions, which we've done over several times over the course of the survey, have estimated biases ranging from 4 to 23%. So once we did the expansion, there was a difference between what we had the expanded region and what we would have had we left the expanded, the new stations off. That gives us a measure of the bias, the error that we were making in our indices. And so that could be quite high or it could be quite low. We want to avoid those kind of biases. We want to reduce them by improving the survey. And we also, the length and age data, if we're not surveying the full area, they may not be representative of the full population of halibut in each regulatory area. This idea for the survey expansion didn't come from nowhere. It's not just something we just cooked up for the fun of it. It's driven by observed data that we have. And for example, one of the first sources of data we looked at which motivated our interest in this expansion was the catch of commercial halibut in deep water. We noticed a few years ago that the commercial halibut were being caught in deeper waters in some areas, and often quite high proportions of the catch were being caught in these deeper waters. So this figure here shows from 1996 to 2013, proportion of commercial catch over the whole year caught in waters deeper than 275 fathoms. And you'll see particularly in areas 4A, 4B, and 4D, the scale there goes up to 25% on the left axis. Quite a substantial proportion of the catch was being caught in these deeper waters, which implies that those are viable halibut habitat. There's fish there, at least for part of the year, and those fish are not being captured in our setline survey. And that there's difference among areas also implies that the indices, the effect of leaving that information out of not including those halibut in our indices is disproportionate. It's different from one area to the next, which could affect the apportionment process. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, yeah, we do catch halibut in deeper waters, but that's mostly in the spring or the autumn, and that's outside when the satellite survey takes place. And we did look at it by month. And also in those areas those regions in Area 4, there is commercial take in those deeper waters in the summer period too, when the survey is taking place. And so this is just one of the data sources that's motivated the expansion. There are others, such as sport estimates in Area 2A driving an expansion into California. And we also have similar figures for shallow waters as well. So currently the IPHC uses 5 estimation procedures, and we have different levels of confidence in the information that those methods are giving us. At the top of the list, the best quality data that we have comes from the IPHC's own setline survey. So we get direct data from that setline survey of weight per unit effort and the age and length data on a standard 10 nautical mile grid that is representative of all habitats and areas which are covered by the setline survey. The second level, we have setline surveys, the IPHC setline survey calibrated to some other survey. And the primary example of this is the Eastern Bering Sea, where we did the survey in 2006. We calibrate it to the NIMS Trawl survey, and that gives us a time series that tracks the NIMS Trawl survey data that is scaled to the observations we got in 2006 from our own survey. Thirdly, we have done some occasional surveys, some one-off, some twice, some that were started and then continued through time in areas where there were gaps or previously gaps. And we use a constant ratio of catch rates for the new expanded area to the annually sampled area to provide a coefficient which allows us to expand up to the full area. The other 2 methods have no direct IPHC sampling. The fourth one, we're using other surveys to provide some kind of calibration, some kind of estimation of an index in a region which we don't have any IPHC data. And the example there is the Northern Bering Sea, which we've never surveyed, but there was a 2010 NIMS survey up there. There's a triennial ADFNG Trawl survey up there as well. So we link those data to the Southern NIMS Trawl survey and the calibration we did there in 2006 to come up with an index. And finally, there's no direct sampling and no other surveys, and we just extrapolate the data we have to areas in which we have no other information. That would be the deep and shallow waters that I talked about earlier and the gaps in coverage in our regulatory areas. So each method makes stronger assumptions than the preceding method, and ideally by expanding the survey, we can move some of the methods in the lower, some of the areas that are in the lower down numbers further up the list. And so here they are again, the 5 methods from best on the left to poorest on the right, and with a summary of the different areas that fall inside each of those. And I've given you a sort of brief verbal summary of that already. So in 2014, we had some changes. We had an expanded survey in Area 2A. So now the Salish Sea, Puget Sound region is part of Method 3. Northern California, north of 39 degrees north, is also part of Method 3. Area 2A and 4A gaps in 20 to 275 grid, plus deeper and shallow waters, are also part of Method 3. And previously, they were down in Method 5. After 2019, when all is said and done, and then we get our wish to do a full expansion of the survey, we hope to have nothing down in Method 5. We would have had direct observations of all of the deep, shallow waters and gaps, with the exception of the Northern Bering Sea, which I'll talk about in a minute, and that's currently under review. So everything will be moved up to at least Method 3, and hopefully there'll be some further improvements, possibly using complementary data that we might be able to make. And importantly, 2015, we'll have an additional calibration in the Eastern Bering Sea flats. So a proposed plan, again in summary, 2014 we did areas 2A and 4A, they're complete. 2015, the important recalibration in the Eastern Bering Sea flats. 2016 and 2017, we placed these areas as high priority because of the large gaps in coverage in those areas, and the likely higher effect on the assessment and apportionment and coast-wide indices that that expansions here will have. So 4C, DE, edge, particularly moving it north, and 4B, where we have about 15% of the area is deeper water. That's higher than anywhere else on the coast, plus it has substantial gaps in the standard depth range. And then finally in 2018, 2019, we'll hopefully knock off 2B, 2C, 3A, and 3B. Where the gaps are smaller, they're less likely to have an effect, a substantial effect on the coast-wide results. In terms of the amount of work that we would have to do, it's fairly substantial, summed up over the whole 6-year period. On an annual basis, it's not so bad, but we're looking at an additional 701 stations. That's an addition. That's on the far right column over there, in addition to the 1,261 stations that we currently have as part of our standard grid. And so there would be between maybe 150 and 82 stations per year, new stations per year. 119 of those in total would be in deeper waters, 74 in shallow waters, mainly in Area 2B and parts of other areas. And 508 of them would be in the standard 20 to 275 fathom range, filling in gaps in the current depth range. So there'll be some cost involved in this, obviously. Vessel costs are projected to be 5 to 12% higher each year of the expansion. But these costs would be at least partially offset by revenue from additional fish sales. So there will be some areas where densities are likely to be lower than average. For example, the deep waters of the Gulf of Alaska, where the data we have from full surveys and other long-line surveys indicate there are very few halibut there. The Eastern Bering Sea, the North 4D Edge, and the Strait of Georgia and 2B are likely to be areas where we have lower than average densities. But that will be offset by areas of relatively high density, relatively high density, such as 20 to 275 fathoms in 2C, 3A, and 3B, which is where most of the, a good chunk of the new stations are likely to be found. And as I pointed out, most of those new expansion stations are in the current depth range. The Northern Bering Sea is a tricky area, and we currently have no proposal for survey expansion in this region. We do get an estimate of weight per unit effort by, as I mentioned before, combining other surveys, data from the Triennial Northern Sound Survey with a one-off survey from NIMS in 2010 covering the whole region, and linking that to the Southern Eastern Bering Sea survey calibration. And we estimate weight per unit effort of 5 pounds per skate, lower than anywhere else coastwide in recent years, and that's about half the value of the southern part of the Eastern Bering Sea. And that area is about 1/3 of the size of the Eastern Bering Sea. So overall, although it looks on paper to be a substantial area, it has a relatively minor to modest effect on the coastwide indices and coastwide assessment information. It's going to be a challenge for a couple of reasons. It's likely that the distribution of halibut is quite patchy there. So if we have, for example, as we did in the Eastern Bering Sea, a sparser grid, it's quite possible we'll miss some patches if they're quite localized patches of high density. So that we may have to think very carefully about the kind of design we employ up there. And there's a high proportion of very shallow halibut habitat in the Northern Bering Sea. That's habitat less than 10 fathoms, which we're not currently considering for inclusion of expansion stations for logistical reasons. So there's some challenges there that we would have to iron out before we can come up with a design for that region. So it's currently under review. So moving along to the kind of information that we're going to get, we might expect to get from this survey expansion. We did our first expansion in 2014, and we came up with some useful information that we did not have previously. So this is a map showing the station setline survey coverage in 2014 in Area 4A. Each symbol represents the location of a station. The circles are in proportion to the weight per unit effort we got at that station. Larger circles means higher weight per unit effort. And the legend there shows that the larger circles are in the vicinity of 400 pounds per skate. Where there's an X, that means we caught nothing. This is over 32, halibut over 32 inches in size, which we use for our index. So that the X means we caught no halibut in that size range. The colors of the symbols, the red are the stations that we had as part of our standard grid up until 2014, prior to 2014. The blue are the stations that were fished for the first time in 2014, the expansion stations. So there are some pretty interesting things that came out of this figure and from the information we got from this. And the first thing that leaped out to us, was that we have pretty good coverage in areas of low density and not so great coverage in areas of high density. So off the southeast of the Aleutian chain there, we have lots of small dots and lots of X's, and excellent coverage, almost no new stations in that region. But the densities are very low. Whereas in the far west of Area 4A, where we had much poorer coverage in the previous survey, but we've got some very large new circles there, both in the, I should mention the green circles and the dark circles were the deeper water new stations. So that both in the green dark circles and in those blue circles, some of the highest densities in Area 4A were in the regions that we weren't surveying. And this is also true to a lesser degree in Unimac Pass, where we had no stations previously, and up on the near the boundary of the 4A edge, the northern boundary of the 4A edge up there. So the catch in the deeper waters, those dark green circles, confirms what we saw in the commercial data, that there are halibut in deeper waters in Area 4A, and that's, as we'll see in a second, not true of all areas. And it also, we learned that the densities in those deeper waters are similar to the densities in the standard depths that we had surveyed previously. So were we to, well, pulling all this information together, we get this calibration coefficient. And what that is the ratio of the survey with everything in it, all the stations, to the survey, the weight per unit effort with the new stations excluded. So it gives us a way of adjusting for the years in which we don't do this expansion. And the ratio is 1.118, which means that the full survey has a weight per unit effort that's 11.8% higher than the survey without those new stations. So that implies that we had a negative bias in our previous estimates of weight per unit effort. We were underestimating weight per unit effort in previous years, assuming the same kind of results that we got this year. And so that's an important piece of information for improving the index and the apportionment for Area 4A. If we would just look at the 20 to 275 stations and forget about the deep and shallow part, the new stations that we added actually had weight per unit effort 32% higher than the existing stations. And those are mostly those stations out in the far west and a couple in Unimac Pass and the edge. So we got some important improvements in the information we have for Area 4A in 2014. And this is the kind of thing we might expect to see in some of those other areas with large gaps like 4D and 4B. We also did an expansion, full expansion in Area 2A in 2014. These are similar maps. The main expansion regions were the Salish Sea, Puget Sound region up there, some decent sized circles up there. The scale is different here because densities are much lower in 2A than in Area 4A, and also Northern California, down to 39 degrees. So some things we learned there. We didn't catch any fish in the new region in Northern California between 39 and 40 degrees. The Salish Sea, Puget Sound region, we did this as a pilot expansion in 2011. Catches were up substantially and weight per unit effort was up 62% from the 2011 value. This is an area with, on its own, does not have a lot of stations, so you expect some high degree of sampling variability. Some difference will just be by chance. But it also could imply that the underlying densities there are quite variable as well. That's impossible to tell from just these 2 years worth of data. As far as Northern California goes, the 15 stations that we did in 2013 and 2014, there was a decrease of 29% in the weight per unit effort for those stations between 40 and 42 degrees north. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're also looking at complementary surveys. The expansion, we've got a proposal for 6 years, and maybe in the future we want to revisit some of those expansions based on if we're going to be looking at other information from other surveys on a regular basis. Anything that tells us that there might be some changes in those areas that are out of line with the survey that we're doing now could give us cause for going back and doing and trying to do some of those expansions again. But in years that we're not able to do those expansions, in areas that we can't sample on an annual basis, we may be able to make some use out of information from other surveys. So we're looking at various other surveys done by other agencies and potentially calibrating those with our own setline survey. So the idea here is that we're going to move more regions out of Method 3 and up into Method 2, where the Eastern Bering Sea method is the only, Eastern Bering Sea calibration is the only item in that box. So again, adding a further improvement to the data. And we began this process in 2014 by making use of the NIMS Sablefish Longline Survey, which has pretty good complementary coverage in many areas for deeper waters in particular. So we used it to come up with an index for halibut in deeper waters for areas 2C, 3A, 3B, and the area 4D edge. Turns out those indices of deep water density were close to zero in all areas in recent years except for the area 4D edge. And because we don't have a similar survey to use in area 2B with similarly comprehensive coverage, we're using the area 2C deep water index for area 2B too. The observed deep water IPHC setline survey data are still being used in areas 2A and 4A. This year, last year, we received some data from NIMS of their trawl survey in area 2A, so there's the potential to use that for deep water in years coming up, but we didn't have time to look at that for 2014. In area 4A, the sablefish survey coverage is inadequate for halibut in that area. It might be fantastic for sablefish, but what we found was there was a poor correspondence between the index that we get from the sablefish survey and what we actually observed using our own direct data in 2014. So we're not using the sablefish data in area 4A. We're using our own observations and doing the type of calibration that we've done in the past for that. Also in area 4B, sablefish survey coverage of halibut habitat is poor, and we continue to apply the weight per unit effort for 20 to 275 to all depths in all areas in area 4B. So just to summarize the surveys that we're considering or we've been looking at, the red here indicates an annual survey with good coverage, the orange a biennial survey with good coverage, yellow, which should be on the next page, is bi- or triennial survey with limited coverage, and green is surveys of limited use for halibut, either because of the timing or the frequency or the quality of the coverage for halibut habitat. So we're currently using the one at the top of the list, the Bering Sea Trawl Survey, for our calibration in the Eastern Bering Sea. We're going to be looking closely at the Area 2A Bottom Trawl Survey this year, hopefully to come up with a deep water index and an index for Northern California in years in which we cannot do an expansion in that area. We've used the Alaska Sablefish Longline Survey for the first time in 2014. And other useful, potentially useful data sources include the Gulf of Alaska Bottom Trawl Survey, which has fairly good complementary coverage every other year. And there are some other surveys we're looking at. We already used the Northern Sound Trawl Survey. It's the best thing we have going up in the Northern Bering Sea right now. And there are some slope surveys and other trawl surveys that we might consider using, and there are various other surveys that are of much more limited use. So there's a lot of complementary data out there. Some of it's going to be more useful than others, but we're taking a close look at these data with the hope that they can be used to complement, but not replace, the expansions that we propose over the next 5 to 6 years. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. Ian, you're going to provide a presentation on two main components, I understand. I was thinking that maybe if we went through the stock assessment piece for 2014 and then took a break for 10 minutes or so before going on to the second. Does that work for you?
Sure. See if this is on. Can you hear me? Yeah, that would be fine, Mr. Fisher. Good afternoon. My name is Ian Stewart. I'll be presenting, as Mr. Chairman just pointed out, I'll be presenting the results of this year's stock assessment, and then we'll take a short break and I'll come back and present the results of the apportionment and the catch table analyses for this year. The annual meeting is the most exciting time of the year for the Halibut Commission. This is when we finally get to show you guys everything we've done over the entire year, and it all becomes relevant and sets the stage for the management decisions that will be made during this week. I'd like to start out by saying that although I get to stand up here and make the presentation of the stock assessment, it's really the collective work of the entire staff, and everybody at the Halibut Commission has contributed to this effort this year. So I just get the fun of getting to present it to you guys. The other thing I'd like to say is that I've only got one afternoon to present here, and although I would love to go through all of the detail of all the various supporting analysis we've done, I just don't have time to do that. And unfortunately, I'm sure I'm going to leave out some things that some of you really wanted to hear about. I'll point you to a couple of resources. All of our RARA and our Blue Book, all of the various documents are on our website, as well as the slides from this presentation. So if you want to download those and look at them at your own pace, you can do that. In addition, we've done a bunch of supporting research to the stock assessment this year, including looking at juvenile halibut distribution in Alaska, looking at commercial logbook information and other ways to model those data, looking at historical aging efforts back into the 1920s. And we don't have time to talk about all of that this afternoon, but it's there in the RARA document. And I'll be here all week. I'd love to stop and talk to some of you who have some interest in some of those specific projects as the week goes on. So with that, I'll get into the presentation of this year's stock assessment. I'm going to start with just a summary. This is the short version. The coastwide survey and the fishery both have been showing relatively stable trends for the last couple of years. The theme for this year is really going to be stability at the coastwide level, but a lot of really interesting detail at the area-by-area level. So although we're seeing some pretty consistent patterns across the entire coast, that's masking the fact that we're seeing some really different trends in different regulatory areas. And I'll spend some time on various slides showing you just how different some of those trends are among the different regulatory areas. In terms of modeling this year, so that's data. In terms of modeling this year, we've improved the ensemble of models. We've added 2 new models, and they've given us a little bit more perspective, not only on the history of the stock, but as well on some of the area-to-area trends that are going on and how those feed into the coastwide dynamics. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. In a nutshell, the results from this year's stock assessment and even through the catch tables at the coastwide level and in general are somewhat more optimistic than we've seen in recent stock assessments. I think there's a little room for optimism here this year. We've seen some stability and some trends that have really been looking like they've been going down for a long time, and in some places seem to be flattening out or even going up. So I'm going to recap a little bit of some of the catch statistics that Heather covered, but not in quite as much detail, and with a little bit more of an eye toward the productivity of the stock and generally the bigger picture. I'll point out here that I've tried on each slide to note where I am in the briefing book. So at the bottom here, this is briefing book page 108. If you want to follow along, or if you can't read something from the back, I understand some of these slides are going to be difficult to read the detail on from the back. These are almost all in your briefing book, so you can find that reference and check them out. So setting the stage for the annual stock assessment, we can look back through the history of the halibut fishery. We've removed right around 7 billion pounds of halibut from the North Pacific over the last 100 years, and we still have a strong, sustainable fishery. You can see that the fishery's gone through several peaks. We've gone through 4 large peaks in removals, each peak being slightly larger than the one before it. Although, even back in the early 1900s, we had a peak that was around 70 million pounds for almost a decade. It was a pretty substantial amount of removals back at that time period, especially given the technology they had to catch those fish. You'll notice that in addition to the peaks getting slightly larger over time, you'll see there's more colors as you go on, and each of the colors represents a different user group or a different source of removals from the stock. And what you can see here is that the stock has become more and more fully subscribed as time has gone on. There's more users accessing the stock, and more removals at the height of each of these peaks. You can also see at the end here, and I'm sure you're all well aware, we've seen some very large declines in the removals from this stock over the last 15 years as management has responded to declining trends that we've seen in the abundance of the stock. If we zoom in on that period at the end a little bit, just from 1960 onward to get a little better sense of how these trends have played out, you can see that the directed fishery landings in dark green along the bottom of the slide here have been the bulk of the removals over this whole time period. You can see the bycatch in purple along the top has been an important contributor. As well in blue down the middle there, or sort of purple depending on your color vision, the band down the middle there is the sport removals, and that's become an important contribution to the total removals, especially in some regulatory areas. Now, if we draw a line across where we are currently at 2014, you can see that we're still above a number of those years in the late 1970s when the fishery, the total yield from the stock was quite low. We're still somewhat in excess of those levels, although we are getting down relatively close to those levels we saw in the late 1970s. If we compare that to the 100-year average now, the 100-year average is around 64 million pounds. And that's probably not a bad estimate of what the long-term average yield or average productivity we might expect to get out of this stock. But that doesn't mean we can expect to get 64 million pounds out of this stock in any particular year. This is a very dynamic stock. It responds to the environment, all of the various sources of removals, what's going on with other species in the ecosystem. And so although the stock seems to be oscillating around a level that's around 64 million pounds, that's not something that we should expect to see on an annual basis. It's just the long-term average. Now, if we zoom in even farther, just to the last 5 years, and I'll show you here the breakdown of removals by source. On the left-hand side of this table are the directed fishery landings. And you can see that those have come down substantially over the last 5 years. The second column is the wastage in the directed commercial fishery. As Heather pointed out, the wastage is fish that are killed associated with lost fishing gear, regulatory discards, as well as fish that are discarded that are sublegal and some of which subsequently die. Moving across the table there, sport, personal use, and subsistence, bycatch, and then the total removals over the last 5 years. And what I want to point out here is how these removals have changed. How has the response gone to reductions in the available yield from the stock? And what you can see here is that the directed fishery, the landings and the wastage together, have come down substantially over the last 5 years in response to management actions taken by this commission. That's succeeded in bringing the total removals down also substantially, around 40% through 2014. You can see that the other sources of removal, sport, personal use, and bycatch, although they have also been reduced, they've not been reduced to the same degree as the directed fishery. And I'm sure this is not news to many of you, but it just shows you how these reductions have played out across the various sectors that are accessing this resource. I want to go on now to some of our survey results for this year. There's a lot of information on here, and I'm sure some of you in the back are probably struggling just to read the legend and the various information here. This is in the blue book. You can look more closely. I'm going to take just a second to walk you through this figure. What this figure represents is all of the results from all of our survey activity for the entire time period that the survey has been going on. Each panel is a regulatory area, starting with area 2A in the top left and ending in the bottom right with the total or the aggregate over the entire coast. This is the weight per unit effort, and the black series or the lower series in each panel is the O32 or legal size weight per unit effort. So it's the amount of weight that was caught per standardized skate in our setline survey of legal size fish. The blue or the series that's slightly above the black series is the total weight per unit effort. So that includes not just legal size fish, but also sublegal fish. So it's the total catch of fish. And a few things, you don't really need to be able to read the details on this to see the general trends from the back of the room. The labels right below each area label, there are percentages for total and O32, and those represent the percent change from 2013 to 2014. And I put those up there because it's a reference. You can see, well, which area went up and which area went down from last year. But really, I think that those of you in the back of the room probably are getting a better perspective on this if you can't read those, because what you really need to look at is the general trends. And what you can see across the top here, Area 2, you can see relatively flat trends and actually a pretty strong increase in Area 2C. You can see historically some big declines across Area 3 and Area 4A and 4B, and then some leveling out at the end of the time series. I'm going to zoom in on a couple of these panels, and so hopefully you can actually see the series a little bit better. So I'm going to zoom in first on Area 2C, because based on our setline survey results, Area 2C has shown the biggest and most consistent increases over the last 5 to 7 years. You can see that we've seen a consistently increasing trend in both the legal size catch rates of halibut as well as the sublegal size catch rates of halibut. And generally in these figures you can see a pretty similar trend between the legal weight per unit effort and the total weight per unit effort. If I then zoom in on Area 4A, if you were looking at those percentages carefully, you would have noted that the O32% change from 13 to 14 in Area 4A was plus 29%. It was the biggest percent change anywhere across the coast. However, if you step back and just look at the trend there a little bit, what you can see is actually we had a pretty steep period of decline through 2005 in Area 4A. And since then, there's been some more modest decline at a much shallower level. And perhaps over the last 3 to 4 years, there's been some flattening out of the trend there, although it's a bit variable in 2A. So I would say this is a good example of where probably the 29% is not the most important thing to focus on, but the general trend we've seen over the last 3 to 4 years. If I then focus on the total, this is the aggregate across the entire coast-wide survey as we see it. And what you see here is pretty clear and consistent decline from the beginning of our setline survey in 1997 right through 2010. It was basically a monotonic slide all the way down. The stock was declining, the average weight per unit effort was declining through 2010. Since 2010, what we've seen is basically a stable stock. We've seen a little bit of up, a little bit of down, but at the coastwide level, we're starting to see some stability. This is now 4, maybe 5 years in a row of pretty flat trajectory out of the stock, which that's actually kind of good news after the period before it. If I move now and look at numbers per unit effort, in weight per unit effort integrates two things. It integrates the number of fish being caught, and it integrates the weight of each fish that's being caught. So it's really, there's a lot of information packed into that. If we just look now for a second at the numbers per unit effort, and everything else is the same here, the color series are the same, what you can see here is that the trends are a little bit different. You'll note that, for example, in 3A, which is the middle row on the left-hand side, especially for the total weight per unit effort, the declines from the early 2000s through around 2010 are much less pronounced. There's still a decline there, but it's not nearly as pronounced as it was in terms of weight per unit effort. And what this represents is this is the difference between the numbers of fish and the weight of those fish. So what we've seen here is that we have seen a decline in the number of fish being caught by the setline survey, but the decline in numbers is not as significant as the decline in the weight per number of fish. That's the size of those fish as time has gone on. Although you will note, for example, in the very center square here, area 3B, although the scale's a little different, we've seen a pretty strong decline in both the weight and the numbers there. And it doesn't really matter whether you look at the legal size or the total. You can see in area 3B there's a much bigger gap between the black and the blue, meaning that there's a lot of sublegal fish being encountered in area 2B. But the trend in numbers of those fish has been pretty similar over that time period. Now, if we move now from the setline survey to the commercial fishery logbooks, we can look at the same sorts of trends, the same sorts of information. For the commercial fishery, I'm going to start with the aggregate, the coastwide trend, and that's this dark black line in the middle. And if you compare that to what we saw in the setline survey, you see a pretty similar pattern here. You see declines from the late 1990s through somewhere around 2010, and then a little bit of variability, but perhaps a little bit of stability at the end of this time series. I want to point out with regard to our fishery logbooks that we're compiling this logbook on the 11th of November, and the fishery ended on the 7th of November. So we're doing our best to include as many of these logs as we can, but the logbook data that I have available in each year for the current year is still incomplete, and it always gets updated a little bit. Our data entry and our port samplers and everybody are working hard to get as much of that in as we can, but it's not always complete. And so remember that as we're looking at these. These will change slightly when we see the results next year. But at the coastwide level, we're seeing a relatively similar trend to what we saw in the setline survey. Now, when we drill into the specific regulatory areas, I'll start with area 2, 2A, 2B, and 2C. You can see in these areas, we actually haven't had nearly as much of a historical decline in catch per unit effort as we've seen certainly in the setline survey in some of those areas and in some of the other regulatory areas. So a lot of variability here, and there has been some decline in certain areas, but generally we've seen a fairly flat trend in the commercial catch per unit effort across area 2. And in fact, if you look from 2010 onward, all three of these series are increasing at slightly different rates, but we've seen some improvement in the fishery catch per unit effort in area 2 over the last 4 to 5 years. Now, if I add area 3 to this plot, you can see that the story's a little different there. We have seen some pretty big declines from the late 1990s and pretty much continuing right through 2014. So this is a little bit of a different story than we saw in the setline survey, where the setline survey in area 3A and 3B is showing some signs of flattening out over the last couple of years. We actually saw some continued declines in the fishery catch per unit effort in these areas. And I'm not 100% sure why that would be, why the two things would be showing different trends. There are a lot of potential reasons, but I can't tell you for sure why that is. If I then add area 4B on this plot, it's a little hard to see here. It's dark green. It's also got a similar pattern of some historical decline and right through 2013 with a little uptick in 2014. If I add the rest of area 4, again, it's starting to get a little cluttered, and I'll show you a different way to look at this in a second. But you can generally see a similar pattern, which is declines from the late 1990s through around 2010, and then perhaps some flattening out in most of those areas in area 4. Next, I'll show you the same kind of figure that I showed you for the setline surveys. This is the same data that I just showed you, the weight per unit effort from the fishery logbooks, just in the same format that I showed you for the setline survey. These, the gray bands to the left-hand side of each panel represent the area where the fishery weight per unit effort goes back to an earlier time period than I had for the survey. So if you're just looking at the survey trend, it would start right where that gray ends. Because you note in many of these, you'll see a period of stability in that earlier time period. If you look, for example, across the middle row, area 3A, 3B, and 4A, that period from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, generally it was kind of up and down, but there were pretty high catch rates, pretty sustained high catch rates over that time period. Unfortunately, we don't have a survey to compare over that time period. But these are the same results you saw, the same format you saw for the setline survey, directly comparable to that figure. And in general, pretty similar pattern, especially at the coast-wide level. I think the places that stand out most to me as differing are area 3A and 3B, where we've seen continued decline over the last couple of years in the commercial fishery weight per unit effort, where we saw some flattening out in the setline survey. Okay, now from the trends into some of the biology that we see in the stock. So this plot is the mean weight in the landings by regulatory area for as far back as we can reliably piece together. So this goes all the way back to the mid-1930s. And before we even get into the details, you can see a pretty general pattern here, which is that the fish were pretty small back there in the 1930s and 40s. In fact, even a little bit smaller than the fish are today that were being landed. The average size increased relatively slowly. You'll note right in the middle there's a bit of a dogleg where the average size jumps up pretty substantially in a one-year time period. That's in fact when the minimum size limit was put in 1973. And the reason why the average size goes up is because they were no longer allowed to retain and land those smaller fish, and so the average size of the fish that was landed goes up. And that's a good reminder that this is what's being landed. So this is integrating a lot of different things. It's integrating what's being caught, what's available in the population. It's integrating the age structure in the population and the size structure. A lot of different things go into this, but this is kind of the bottom line. What size fish are actually coming to the dock in each of these regulatory areas? The other thing you can note, in addition to this up and down trend, is that average size at age tends to change pretty slowly over this time period. You know, we've been looking for the last couple of years. At the very end of this time series, you can see that the black series down the middle, maybe it's got a little bit of up and down. Maybe it's starting to flatten out as well. But looking back at the historical period would suggest that probably it's not going to change really fast. What we tend to see is a fairly slow change in something like average size of fish landed. There's a lot of other detail that you can get out of this. For example, you can look at just the two blue lines, which is 3A and 3B, and note that for most of the historical period, they were big fish. They were well above the coast-wide average in area 3A and 3B. And right around, sometime around 2000, they dipped below that dark black line, and now area 3A and 3B are, on average, producing fish that are somewhat smaller than other regulatory areas. Again, there's a lot of detail here, and I don't have time to go through all of the trends, but it is in your in the background material that's available. If we now look, so that figure integrated a lot of different variables, the age and size structure, the fishing behavior. Now let's zoom in for a second and just look at some of the trends we've seen in size at age. And I'll point you to the left-hand panel here. What I'm showing you here is age across the x-axis and weight of a fish in net pounds on the y-axis. Females on the left, males on the right. Note that the scale is different because females get a lot bigger than males. And just draw your attention to a couple things. If we were to look, say, on the left-hand side here, right in the middle of that plot would be a 13-year-old female. And if we look back to 1975, that 13-year-old female would have been on average somewhere around 50 pounds. And this is a coast-wide average. This is an amalgam of all the regulatory areas and pieced together from both the survey information and the fishery information. But nonetheless, that 13-year-old female back in 1975 would have been around 50 pounds. If you look then to 2014, that same female at age 13 is around 20 pounds. This is a big change in size at age. This is as big a change, I think, as we've seen in any groundfish that I'm familiar with in the Pacific here. This is a very large change. And I wish I could tell you why this is happening. We don't know why this is happening. We have some evidence that the fish were actually pretty small for their age back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and that they hit a peak sometime in the late 1970s. They were about as big for their age during that time period as they've ever been in the historical record, and they've been declining since then. We don't know all the factors that are contributing to this, but it's likely that there are multiple factors, and we have a large research project going investigating a number of these. But the point being here is that even if the only change we'd had in the stock between 1975 and 2014 was this. Even if we had the same number of fish out there, we'd only have 20 pounds for every 50 pounds we had in the 1970s. That's a pretty big change in the biology of this species over this time period. You'll also note on the right-hand panel that the males have shown a pretty similar pattern. The only other thing I would say about this is that if you look a little bit more closely, and it doesn't jump out, but it's there, there's more of that change between 1975 and 1995 than there was between 1995 and 2014. The bulk of that change happened pretty rapidly, coming down out of the late 1970s through the 80s, and it has slowed down somewhat in recent years. Now, if we zoom in a little bit even farther, so that was a coast-wide average. Now, if we look at just the female-weighted age trends, and we just zoom in on a couple regulatory areas. So this is a little bit of a complicated plot. You've got year across the x-axis and the weight of fish across the y-axis. These two panels are on a different scale, so I'm going to give you a little point of reference here. This is area 4B on the left and 3A on the right. And there's a lot of lines and bubbles and things on here. Each row of bubbles, or each line across there, represents an age, starting at age 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up through to age 18 plus, all the fish that were at least 18 years old or older. And the colors are just to sort of help keep track of that. There are panels like this for males and females for every regulatory area in the background material. So if you're interested in what the fish in your area have been doing, you can go and find that information. I want to point out here 40-pound fish. So in area 4B, a 40-pound fish is about a 14-pound female. Or sorry, a 14-year-old female. And it's been pretty consistent. So I've shown you this at the coast-wide level. We've seen some pretty big changes in size at age. But in area 4B, we've seen almost no change in size at age during this time period. In area 3A, that same fish, that same 14-year-old female, was also about 40 pounds. Note it's in a different place on the graph back in the late 1990s. But today, in 2014, that 14-year-old female is pretty close to 20 pounds. So we've got some big differences in how these trends in biology are playing out among the various regulatory areas. We've got an area like 4B that's showing almost no trend in size at age, and we've got an area like 3A that's showing some pretty strong trends in size at age. And it's important to remember as we look through all of these various trends that even when we put it together at the coast-wide level, we can still acknowledge that there are some very different patterns going on from area to area. Okay, now I want to move into the age structure of the stock. So this is the coast-wide fishery age structure. So this is the weighted aggregate age structure across all the regulatory areas up to the coast, and it's just a recent time period from 1996 on. And there's year across the x-axis of this plot from 1996 through 2014. Note that the bubbles are just to the right of the year labels because the fishery is actually operating partway through the year. And the y-axis here is age, from age 16 all the way to age 25. In the early time period, up until 2002, we didn't have break and burn aging. Our quality of our aging method wasn't as good, and we couldn't resolve those fish that were older than 20 years old. So they're all aggregated at age 20. I'll point out a couple things here. One thing is that because year goes up by 1 and age goes up by 1 on both axes, if we draw a diagonal line, we can track strong cohorts. And I've drawn a line here on the 1987 cohort, which you can see has pretty strong bubbles all the way across. Each bubble represents the proportion of fish in the catch in that year that were that age. So the bigger the bubble, the more fish of that age were caught in that year. And the scale here is roughly a quarter of the fish in the catch would be the largest size of the bubble. So note here, say for example in 2000, those fish that were 13 years old, that's the 1987 year class. That was about a quarter of the catch in that year came out of that single year class. And in fact, if we added up across the diagonal, that single year class, 1987, produced somewhere on the order of about 200 to 225 million pounds of landings just from that one year class. That was the single biggest year class we estimate to have occurred in this stock during the whole historical record. You also note that that year class lasted. It stuck with it right out through the mid-2000s. You can track that diagonal right out into the older age structure. And what we've seen since that cohort has died out in the more recent period is back to a level of an age structure in the stock that's dominated primarily by fish that are 8 to, say, 15 or 16 years old. And this is actually pretty typical. If you look in the background materials, you can see figures that go all the way back into the 1930s, and you'll see that 8 to 15 years old has been pretty much the standard age out of this stock throughout the whole historical period of fishing. So what we saw in the early 2000s as those big cohorts from the 90s moved through was a much more protracted age structure than we'd seen really in any other time in the historical period. And so what we're seeing now is actually a relatively stable age structure, but quite a bit younger than it was 10 to 15 years ago. I'm not going to show you the survey ages because, honestly, the figure looks almost exactly the same. It's the trends that we see in the age structure in the survey are really very similar to what we see in the set line in the commercial fishery. Those figures are available in the background materials. I want to finish out the discussion of various data sources by commenting on the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. I spent quite a bit of time here at the meeting last year describing to you the correlation between the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and recruitment strength, or the number of young halibut that were coming into the stock. It's been a pretty strong correlation over our historical time period. We don't understand exactly what's driving that, but it has been a correlation. And what we've seen over the historical period, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation itself represents the environmental conditions primarily in the Gulf of Alaska. So when you're above that stripe down the middle of this plot into positive values, that's generally warmer waters in the Gulf of Alaska and generally a little bit more productive waters in the Gulf of Alaska. It's actually an inverse relationship with the lower 48 down off Washington, Oregon, and California. It's the opposite. If you're below that strip down the middle in the red dots, that's a time period when we see less productivity in the Gulf of Alaska. Generally cooler waters, and the general transport in the Gulf of Alaska tends to be offshore, to the south and offshore during that time period, which is probably not great for getting young halibut larvae up onto the shallow shelf areas that they need to recruit to. I spent quite a bit of time on this last year, and what I pointed out was that as of 2007, we had moved into what the ecosystem and environmental scientists were calling another negative regime for the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. However, you'll note that 2014 then promptly came in well above that strip down the middle. It was very warm in the Gulf of Alaska. It showed signs of high productivity. However, almost all the other indices that are being tracked were somehow off the chart in 2014. 2014 was just very different throughout the Gulf of Alaska ecosystem. And honestly, we don't know exactly how that's going to affect the Pacific halibut stock. But what we do know is that it's going to be about a decade until that 2014 year class starts to show up in the data and we start to be able to see them. So those fish have been born. They're already out there swimming around, but it's going to be as much as 10 years before we really get a good sense of how abundant they're going to be. And that's a good reminder to why we have so much uncertainty in the assessment of this stock, because we have to wait a long time. Those fish have to be out there subject to lots of different environmental factors, lots of different sources of mortality for a pretty long time before they finally recruit to our fishery, somewhere between 8 and 15 years old. Okay, that's the first chunk of this talk. I'm going to now move into the assessment modeling, and then I think I'll take a break at the end of assessment before I go into apportionment. Let everybody take a deep breath and wake up a little bit, and we'll get going again. But I will go through the assessment part of this talk. I'm going to break this into 3 pieces. I'm going to talk about the assessment, the ensemble that we used for this year, the results, and then also present the results of the decision table. So a little bit about ensemble model development. This is something that we started in 2012. Ensemble means using more than one model. We started in 2012 using the historical IPHC model that we'd always had, but we used 3 different levels of natural mortality, 3 different models built around a different assumption about how productive the stock was, how much mortality was going on out there. We integrated those into the final results because it was a source of uncertainty that we still don't understand very well. In 2013, we extended this. We still included uncertainty in natural mortality, but we also added one model that used all 100 years of the data that we had available. It's something that we hadn't done before, which is try to integrate all the understanding, all the data that we had into one analysis and include that with the short time series models that we had to try to get a little more perspective on how the stock has changed historically and where we are now in relation to that. So that was what we did in 2013. For 2014, in concert with, in conversation with our scientific review board, I investigated a number of different models for potential inclusion into this ensemble. We looked at the models we've been using. We also looked at a virtual population analysis, which is really popular in the northeastern United States and in Europe. It's something that the Commission actually used back in the 1970s and 80s during some time periods. We looked at a simple surplus production model, which is really just about as simple a model as you can get. And we also extended to include an areas as fleets approach. And an areas as fleets approach allows us to start to get at some of the differences between the different regulatory areas. We can now break the data up into the information from each of the regulatory areas In this case, just 4. We aggregated area 2, 3, 4, and 4B. But it allows us to get a little bit more spatial resolution into the analysis. So we did this, and after reviewing these models and looking at their performance, looking at their behavior, we opted to include 4 of these models in the stock assessment results for 2014. These included both a short and a long time series model for both a coast-wide and an areas as fleets approach. So we're really covering looking at the most recent data, which is complete and takes far fewer assumptions to model, versus looking at the entire time series, which is messy. It's got a lot of gaps in it, but it can tell us some things about the history, with aggregating everything to the coast-wide level versus retaining some of that heterogeneity between the different regulatory areas. The other models that we didn't explicitly include in here, the VPA, tended to give us a pretty similar impression of the relative trends in the stock. The simple surplus production model, really all that model could tell us was roughly how much yield can you get out of the stock and keep the biomass at about the same level. And the results from that suggested something on the order of 40 to 45 million pounds. Quite uncertain, really not using much of the data at all, but just suggesting that a removal somewhere around 40 to 45 million pounds is probably consistent with the yield that's available from this stock. And that's actually pretty close to what we're getting out of these more complicated models as well. So it's kind of a check on these models to see whether the scale was consistent with just a very simple approach. I want to take just a second to reiterate the difference between a coast-wide and an areas as fleets model. So in a coast-wide model, we model the stock as one giant pool of fish. And we have a single fishery. We cook all the data down into one fishery index. We cook all the survey down into one survey index, and we model that. It's a pretty simple thing. It's really just a smoother through those coast-wide trends. An areas as fleets models actually allows us to keep the data separate. So in this case, we separated area 2, 3, 4, and 4B into separate time series. So we can now acknowledge that there can be different trends going on, slightly different properties in the data in each of those areas. But importantly, it's still a coast-wide population model. We're still not creating a fully spatial model. A fully spatial model actually has to move fish among the areas explicitly and deal with how the recruitment is distributed and how the adults are going to be distributed and how they move among areas, and we're not there yet. We're working on it, and this is something that you may see in a future ensemble or at least an analysis, a future analysis, but we're not there yet. So an areas as fleets model is an intermediate step in that direction. It's not a perfect approach. It's just another way to approximate the dynamics of a stock that has some important spatial components going on. Okay, so what do these actually show us? Well, this is a comparison of the 2 short models from starting in 1996. The areas as fleets models in the brighter orangish, reddish sort of color, and the coast-wide model in blue. And you'll note right away, if you're at the back of the room, these are actually pretty similar results. If you're sitting in the front, you might notice that the last couple of points, the areas as fleets model is actually suggesting that the spawning biomass may be increasing slightly over the last 2 to 3 to 4 years. Not much, but maybe a little bit, where the coast-wide model is suggesting just a really pretty much a flat trajectory over the last couple of years. So depending on how you look at this and what your interpretation is, you may think these are sort of different, or maybe they're just pretty much a similar look at where we've been, coming down from a fairly high biomass in the late 1990s, and then some stability from 2010 onward. If we now look at the long time series models, these two are a little bit more different. And same color scheme here. The areas as fleets is the brighter orangish color, and the coast-wide models in blue. And you see they differ quite a bit in where we were historically. And this is because we don't have full representation of all the regulatory areas historically. Most of the data that we collected back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s was from Area 2. So the Area 2 dynamics are tending to drive that model a little bit more. In the areas as fleets models, we just don't have data for those fishing fleets in the other areas. So there's pros and cons to both these approaches, but what I want to point out is that they both show a pretty rapid fishing down of the stock through somewhere in the 1930s, a long period of fairly low stock size and some consistency through the late 1970s, and then following some big recruitments, an increase in biomass through the late 1990s. And both of these models suggest that we had pretty historically high biomass levels, certainly for the last 70 or 80 years, right around the late 1990s and early 2000s. A decline after that, and then as you saw in the short time series models, the areas as fleets models is suggesting a slightly more optimistic trend at the end of this time series than the coast-wide model. Now, with these longer time series models, we can start to make just some comparisons. So if we thought about, well, where would the stock be if we weren't fishing at all? It would go through big swings of abundance just because of changes in size at age and recruitment. But there'd be some average level of biomass over a 100-year period that we would see. And the question would be, well, where are we now relative to that long-term average if we hadn't been fishing the stock? And both of these models are suggesting that we're somewhere around 35% of that long-term average, which is actually a pretty typical fisheries target. That's pretty much where most fisheries harvest policies would suggest you want to be. It's somewhere between 30 and 40% of that long-term average biomass. If we then compare back to a period that I'm sure a lot of you can still remember, the late 1970s, when fishing was poor, we were pretty sure that the stock was at a pretty low level. We can say, well, how does the stock biomass now compare to where it was in the late 1970s? And this is where these two models differ quite a bit. What we see here is that the areas as fleets models suggest that we're about a third higher in spawning biomass than we were in the late 1970s. The coastwide model suggests we're more like twice as much biomass as we were in the late 1970s. So there's quite a bit of uncertainty there. And I think it's important to remember that we do have this uncertainty as we move forward through the results here. I can't tell you which one of these is right. In fact, neither of these is right. Both of these is just an approximation of what's gone on. It's a smoother put through the data, and the data have been aggregated in a slightly different way. So they're both perhaps a useful way of looking at the stock, telling us a little bit different story about where we are right now. If we put all four of these models together, you can see that as a general trend, this is sort of what you guys know already from being out there on the water. There were a lot of fish around in the late 1990s, and there were a lot less of them around in 2010. Since then, it's been kind of variable. Depending on how we account for the area-to-area differences, there's been a little bit of increase since 2010, or maybe it's been fairly flat. And that's pretty much how we understand the stock dynamics at the moment, given the models that we have available to us. If we now take a slice across 2015, and we look at the distribution of these models across 2015, each of these curves here is the distribution from a single model, and that line down the middle is the 50-50 line. So the little arrows are indicating the point estimate from each of these models. I'm sure a lot of you are sitting here thinking, well, I kind of like that model there, or I kind of like that model. We do the same thing. We look at this model and think, well, the assumptions it's making about this data set may be better than this model, but this model is probably operating better in this fashion. The point is, the reason why we're using an ensemble and using all four of these models is that what we've learned over the last 30 years is that we may have a model and we may start to sort of fall in love with it and think it's doing pretty well, and then a few years later we find out it's not fitting the data quite so well anymore. And that's been our track record. Something works for a while and then it doesn't work so well for a while. And then we have to jump to a new model, and that would represent jumping between these arrows on the bottom axis here. And rather than just say, well, okay, we're going to use this model this year, and then maybe next year we'll jump from the arrow on the left to the arrow on the right, or the arrow on the right to the one on the left, what we're doing now with this ensemble is we're integrating this uncertainty into the decision table. So the decision table represents the fact that we don't know which of these is a better approximation of what's actually going on out there. And the probability distribution reflects our uncertainty not only within each model, but across these four models. So we can turn that into one distribution. And this is a new plot. So I'm going to take a second to introduce you guys to it, because it's one I didn't show you guys last year. This is the spawning biomass across the x-axis. This is what's called a cumulative plot. And what it's showing you is the chance that the stock is below a certain level of biomass in times out of 100. So if we start with the 50-50 line, read right across, and we can follow that down. That's also called the median. And we can see that the estimate at the 50-50 line is a little over 200 million pounds of spawning biomass. That suggests that there's roughly an equal chance that the actual spawning biomass is above or below that level. But we can also see there's a full distribution here. So we can say, well, what's the biomass level that there's a 90% chance we're above, or no more than a 10 out of 100 chance that we're below that level? So we can read that off this plot as well. Or we can say, well, what's the level of biomass that there's only a 10 out of 100 chance that we're above that level? So we can read off that as well. And you can see there's a pretty big spread there. We're actually fairly uncertain about exactly how much halibut biomass is out there swimming around in the water right now. It's probably around 200 million pounds. If we compare that back to where we were last year, the 2014 estimate for spawning biomass in last year's stock assessment was just under 200 million pounds. This year it's just over 200 million pounds. But based on the uncertainty I've shown you here, you can see that that's really pretty much the same answer. We're estimating just about the same amount of biomass out there this year as we had from the results of last year's stock assessment. Okay, This brings me to the projections and the decision table that we make from each year's stock assessment. I do 1 and 3 year projections. I project out to 3 years. Why don't I project out 20 years? Because I don't have a crystal ball. I can't do it. We do 3 year projections because that's a level of projection that's mainly going to be driven by fish that we've already seen. It's biomass that's out there in the water. It's fish that are being captured by the fishery right now. If I started to make projections that were 5 or 10 years out, those projections would depend very heavily on recruitments that we haven't seen move into the fishery yet and really know very little about. So that's why I only make a 3 year projection, although we'd all like to know where we're going to be in 10 years. Secondly, the projections assume a constant catch level. And I know that we're going to be back here next year discussing management decisions that are probably going to change many of these catch levels. But we have to have a yardstick to gauge how a catch level is going to play out. And so to keep things simple, I'm making the assumption that the catch will stay constant for these projections, noting that it won't, that we'll be back here again next year. And I'm presenting a range of different alternatives, from no removals whatsoever from any sources, any human sources, to all the way up to 60 million pounds in roughly 10 million pound increments, with a few key alternatives in between. One is setting the fishery CEY equal to 0, just so that you can see what are the dynamics if we didn't have a directed fishery, and how much removals would we still have occurring on the stock if we didn't take any in the directed fishery. Also, I'm presenting the results of the 2015 blue line, which is the application of our current harvest policy, as well as the status quo fishery CEYs, which is what if we just set the same catch levels we had last year. The last one here is maintaining the same total fishing intensity, or SPR level. And this is kind of a new concept this year. At our annual meeting last year, the commissioners requested the staff to evaluate ways to account for and manage all sizes and sources of mortality. And the accounting is easy. It's just making all the numbers available, and I'll show you some of that. The managing and the determining what the fishing intensity is a little more complicated. It requires a new metric, which is the spawning potential ratio. And that just measures the equilibrium reduction in the amount of spawning biomass that you're going to get per fish for any level of fishing. It's really actually a standard way to go about this. For those of you that are familiar with the North Pacific or the Pacific Fishery Management Council, this is the way both of those councils set fishing mortality targets. It's based on SPR. It's an F rate associated with all sizes and sources of mortality. What's important here is that this includes fish that are less than 26 inches long. So it gives us a single metric where we can see how heavy is the fishing pressure regardless of how we divide up the different sizes of fishing mortality. It's often reported as an F percentage. And just to give you a sense of how these compare, F35% is what the North Pacific Fishery Management Council uses as their overfishing limit. I'll talk a little bit more, and I'll show you the results of some of this in the decision table here in a second. But I want to just take a second because this is a new metric for the halibut realm here. It's not new for fisheries in general, but it's new to us, and we may see more of it over the next few years. Okay, so now on to the actual projections. In the top right here, you see the projection of the stock under no removals at all from human sources. Now, what I'm plotting here is year on the x-axis, spawning biomass on the y-axis. The dark line down the middle of that shaded patch is the 50-50 line. So it's the line, there's an equal chance that the stock is above or below that line. And the color gradations just show you the relative chances out of 100 that the stock would fall into that band. You can see we're pretty uncertain back there in the late 1990s about just how big the stock got. But there's clearly been some decline in the stock. And then the color change there is the transition between the beginning of 2015, the biomass that we know right now, and the projections through 16, 17, and 2018 in the other color. And what you'll see is that if we didn't catch any halibut from any fisheries for the next 3 years, the stock is projected to increase. We'd have an increase in uncertainty as well, and not all of the different trajectories the stock might take would be increasing, but we would be projecting an increase at a modest level over the 3-year time period. On the bottom right-hand panel of this slide is the projection under a 60 million pound removal. So this would be substantially larger than anything we've seen in several years from the stock. And what you can see there is that under a 60 million pound removal over the next 3 years, the stock would be projected to decrease. Not a huge amount, but it would be projected to decrease over that time period. And again, you'd see more uncertainty as time went on, although slightly less uncertainty than with no removals. The harder you fish these stocks, the more you tend to learn about them over time. On the left-hand side here is the blue line. And the blue line represents the application of our current harvest policy. It's just one of the alternatives that we present in the decision table. And you can see that the blue line represents a pretty flat projection over the next 3 years, suggesting that levels of harvest somewhere around what are being suggested from the current harvest policy would tend to keep the stock roughly stable at the level it's at right now. You may be thinking back to last year and the year before and noticing that the trends here are a little bit steeper than they were last year and the year before, meaning that the difference between no removals and 60 million pounds is a little more pronounced than it was last year and the year before. And that's kind of to be expected here. What we're seeing is that the stock is leveling out at a lower level of biomass. We've come down from a period that was dominated by some big year classes that were there. They were dying out whether we were catching them or not. The stock was declining. Now we're down to a lower level of productivity, and the relative importance of removals from fishing is becoming more pronounced as we stabilize at this lower stock size. So I think this is probably a general trend that we would expect to see over the next few years, is that there's likely to be a greater response to different levels in catch as we move forward than we've seen over the last, say, decade, where we've not seen as much responsiveness in the stock trend to changes in the harvest level on an annual basis. Okay, that brings me to the decision table, and then almost to the break. Hang in there. I'm going to go through. It's been for some of you, I'm sure it's been a year since we looked at the decision table, and honestly, the decision table cooks down all of the analysis of the assessment into one single set of numbers. So it's a pretty dense graphic. I'm going to remind you how to read this table here. On the left-hand side, the first column is the total removals. You'll note that the top row there is 0. That's the no removals row. The bottom is 60 million pounds of removals. And I've broken it up into roughly equal intervals with a couple differences that I'll talk about in a second. This table is a way to evaluate the trade-off between the benefits, the level of harvest, and the potential risk of various different metrics. And I'm only showing you half the table right now. I'm showing you the half of the table that doesn't have any harvest policy embedded in it. This is just the risk to stock trend. So it has no concept of harvest policy. It's just what is the stock trend likely to do in response to different levels of removals. And this is how you read it. The top here, it says stock trend, spawning biomass, and I'm going to move down column A here. The spawning biomass in 2016 is less than the spawning biomass in 2015 with this chance out of 100. And you'll notice that that chance goes up the greater the removals are. And what that's saying is that the larger the catch you take out, the greater the chance that the stock will be lower next year than it is this year. It kind of makes sense. The more you take out, the higher the probability the stock will be a little lower next year than it is this year. The second column is, okay, well, it's going to be a little lower next year with some chance out of 100, but is it going to be much lower? So this is it at least 5% lower in 2016? You can see those probabilities are quite a bit smaller. And that's consistent with the trends I just showed you on the previous plot, which is that even when we're projecting a decline, we're not projecting a huge decline in this stock, even over quite a few of these harvest levels. The right-hand two columns show you the same projections, but now it's 3 years into the future. What I want to point out here, one, you'll notice there's a pretty big jump in between some of these probabilities, and then there's not much of a jump across those three that I have highlighted there. And that's because those are three different alternatives that are all pretty close to 40 million pounds of total removals, where the other jumps are pretty close to 10 million pounds. So I don't want that to be misleading. The alternatives here are not distributed exactly evenly across the range from 0 to 60 million pounds of removals. Note that this second row here that says 13.1 for total removals, that's the no fishery CEY row. So what that suggests is that if there were no directed fishery CEY, we would still have over 13 million pounds of removals from this stock from other sources, from other fisheries, and from sources of removals that are not directly linked to the fishery CEY on an annual basis. Okay, now I'm going to show you the rest of the decision table. This is the other side, and this side has the harvest policy embedded in it. You probably, if you're at the back of the room, are going to have a hard time reading this. It's in your briefing book, but I want to just point out a couple things here. This presents some new metrics, and each of these metrics is related to the harvest policy. So the first block here is the stock status, and that block represents the level of spawning biomass relative to the long-term equilibrium level. So it's the control points in our harvest control rule. The next section represents fishery trend. And I want to draw a little box around that fishery trend section below the blue line running across the middle there. just to show you that those probabilities, those chances out of 100 are all fairly high. They're all pretty close to 50 out of 100 or greater. And what that suggests is that if you opted for a set of removals for the next 1 to 3 years that were much in excess of the blue line, chances are to get back on the blue line in the future, you would have to reduce those catches with a chance that's 50, 70, even 90 out of 100. The thing I want to point out on here is that now on the left-hand side of this plot, I've broken out a few more columns to show you the total removal. So I've labeled the alternatives now, the blue line being the obvious one across the middle. I've also shown you the status quo, which would be setting the same catch levels for 2015 as we had for 2014. And the one below that, which is maintaining the 2014 SPR, which is the same level of fishing intensity that we estimated to have occurred in 2014. So if we wanted to keep just the same level of fishing intensity of all sizes and sources of mortality, that's the row we would look at to compare to 2014. The blue line, note this new column here, fishing intensity. And note that it starts out with F100%. If we're not taking anything out, we're getting 100% of the spawning biomass we would get in the absence of any fishing. The more fishing we get, the less of that we get. So as you move down, it goes to F73%, 64, 54. The blue line is at F46%, suggesting that our harvest policy is pretty consistent with a level of removals that would reduce the spawning biomass per recruit to just under 50% of its equilibrium value. And that's not too far off fisheries targets for species that are similar to halibut in other fisheries settings. Note that the bottom row there, 60 million pounds, is pretty close. It's F34%. It would be pretty close to what the North Pacific Council would consider to be an overfishing level. Not by design, just by chance in this case. So a couple more comments here. One about uncertainty. As I've said, none of these models is perfect or true. They're just approximations of what's going on out there in the world. A lot of these dynamics are changing over time. Some of these models are doing a pretty good job at mimicking the data right now, and they may or may not continue to do that in the future. All of these analyses, all this stock assessment, and it's not really that fancy. It's just a smoother through the data at the end of the day. All of this is only as good as the removals estimates that I'm getting. So if the removals estimates that I have are somehow flawed, if we're not getting the right amount of fish taken out of this problem, I'm not getting the right estimates of productivity. So it's important to remember that we need to get the right amount of removals taken out of here. And there is uncertainty in some of the sources of removals from this stock, and we need to remember that. Okay, a couple conclusions, and we can take a break from the assessment talk. I think you can see a lot of this story right in the data, which is a good thing. The model is really just there to help you see the data a little better. Much of what the model results suggest you can see right in the underlying series. The trend estimates are a little more optimistic than we've seen in the last couple of years. And as I pointed out, the projections are now a little bit more sensitive to management action than they have been in previous years. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe not. But it's the reality is that we've come down, and the stock appears to have stabilized at a level where fishing is now a little bit more of an important driver in the future trend of the stock. With that, I think I'll take a short break and then get back to a portion of the harvest policy tables.
All right, thanks very much, Ian. It's 3:05 now, so let's get back together at 3:15. Yeah.
You got all that?
I just have a couple of announcements. I'll turn it over to Jim.
There's one announcement for the U.S. side. So U.S. side, if you would listen, please. Our delegation meeting was in the agenda book as from 6:30 till 8:30. Taking advice from all the Americans that I saw at break, we're going to do that, start 15 minutes after this session ends, and then go more than 2 hours. I was afraid some people would have cocktails and come in and be mean to us. So we'll start right after this. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And we'll repeat that before we break because a few people aren't in the room. But I just had one other thing that I wanted to say before we got started as well. In my introduction remarks, I forgot to add a very other important change is that we do have a new Canadian Commissioner, and I think I might have mentioned at the interim meeting, but there's a lot of number of people here that weren't at the interim meeting. And so Ted Asu is the new Canadian Commissioner, and maybe just, thanks very much, Ted. So back to you, Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for coming back after the break. We're through the bulk of the material here now, but we are getting to the tables that I think a lot of you are waiting for, which are the catch tables and the application of the current harvest policy. I've been through the data and I've been through the results of the stock assessment. There's one more supporting piece of analysis we need before we can get into the results of the harvest policy, and that's apportionment. And although I'll be presenting it, this is a collaborative work with my colleague, Dr. Ray Webster here as well. Do I need to get activated? There we go. Okay, so on to apportionment. What is apportionment? Apportionment is the process of using the setline survey, the catch of legal-sized fish in the setline survey, to try and understand how the stock is currently distributed. And we take the raw catch from the setline survey and we adjust it for a number of factors that we know can influence the catch rates that aren't population abundance. Because what we want to know is how the population is distributed. And those include things like fishery timing. If the fishery takes all its catch before the survey goes out, then you'd expect to see fewer fish in the survey. Hook competition. If the survey catches a lot of dogfish or a lot of peacod in a particular regulatory area, well, those hooks couldn't have been occupied by halibut, but that doesn't necessarily mean there weren't halibut there. So those and other factors are taken into account when we calculate the results of apportionment. As Ray described this morning in conjunction with our survey expansion, in addition, for 2014, we've also included all of the results from the survey areas, the calibration to deep water areas, places like the Salish Sea and Northern California, the NIMS Sablefish Survey, all that's been included in these apportionment estimates. So what these represent are our best understanding of how the legal size stock is currently distributed. And this is just a graphical representation on a map to show you where we've been with regard to the results from apportionment. This is the results as of year 2000, the first year after 3 years of conducting the survey. We can first calculate how we think the stock is distributed. And these are the percentages for each of the regulatory areas from 4 CD and E up in the Bering Sea all the way down to 2A on the bottom right. And I'll point out a couple things here. One is that in the western areas, including the Bering Sea, back in 2000 we had about 2/3 of the stock distributed to the west. We had about 1/4 of the stock in the Gulf of Alaska, in the Central Gulf, and we had about 12.5% on the eastern side of the stock. This is where we were in year 2000. Starting in 2000, or perhaps continuing in 2000, from 2000, we saw some pretty big changes in how the stock was distributed. So this figure shows you the trend in those percentages for each area between 2000 and 2015. Now the scale of each of these bar charts is different. What I'm really encouraging you to look at here is how the trends have changed in each area. So starting up in the Bering Sea, you can see that the percentage of the coastwide stock that we estimate to be occurring in the Bering Sea has actually been pretty stable over this time period. If anything, over the last 5 to 6 or 7 years, it's been increasing slightly. Areas 4B, 4A, and 3B, however, are quite different. You can see there, 2000, 2001, there was a lot of the stock in those areas, and it declined pretty substantially and continues to decline in area 4B and 3B. Contrast to the eastern side of the stock, if you look across to 2C, 2B, and 2A, you can see that in the last 4 to 5 years, we've seen some big increases in what fraction of the coastwide stock we believe to be distributed on the eastern side of the stock, much more in area 2 than we've seen in previous time periods. So now if we go back to what the percentages are, as of 2015, comparable to those that I just showed you from 2000, what you can see now, if you add up all the western areas, we're at about 1/3. So we've gone from 2/3 of the stock in the west to 1/3 of the stock in the west. We've got a little bit more of the stock, about 1/3 now in the Central Gulf, and we've got a full 1/3 of the stock on the eastern side in area 2. This is a pretty big change in the distribution of this stock. It's not that all the fish from the west just moved to the eastern side of the stock. It's probably a combination of how the recruitments have been distributed, how the fish have moved during this time period, and how the relative exploitation rates in different parts of the stock have played out. But the aggregate is that we've seen a pretty big shift in how the stock is distributed. Now remember, I just showed you that we've seen a downward trend in the total abundance, but over the last few years, we've seen some stability in the amount of biomass at the coast-wide level, but that biomass appears to be continuing to shift toward the eastern side of the stock. Again, this is important spatial dynamics that you don't see if we only look at the aggregate across the whole coast. So that's apportionment. Apportionment is simply just using the survey to try and understand how the stock is currently distributed. The next piece to get to the catch tables is to apply the harvest policy. And our harvest policy provides for two different targets. It provides for how to distribute the catch and how much catch there should be to distribute. And I'm referring to this in terms of the TCEY, or the total constant exploitation yield. This is not just the fishery CEY, but it's the other directed fisheries as well. The first target, the TCEY distribution, comes directly from apportionment and applying the target harvest rates by area. If we had the same harvest rate in all areas, then apportionment would tell us how to distribute the catch. But because we have different target harvest rates, apportionment is only a piece of this story. The second part, the scale of the TCEY, or the scale of the fishing intensity consistent with our current harvest policy, is based on historical simulation analysis. It's based on trying to find a harvest policy that will keep the stock at a reasonably high biomass level most of the time and avoid huge swings in the amount of yield that's available to remove from that stock. It's a little bit different than a standard MSY calculation that might be in place for a fish species that's managed under the U.S. Magnuson-Stevens Act, where maximum sustainable yield would be the maximum amount of yield available from that stock in any given year. The IPHC's harvest policy is designed with a bit longer term perspective. It's designed to keep the stock at a reasonably high biomass level and to avoid large swings in the amount of yield available from that stock. So the first one, the distribution of the harvest. Again, this is the results from apportionment from 2015. If we add on top of that now the target harvest rates. The target harvest rates are 21.5% for areas 2A through 3A and 16.125% for the western areas, 3B and on out through area 4. So you can see that the target's harvest rates are higher on the eastern side of the stock. That means that when we turn this into catch, there's going to be proportionally more catch on the eastern side of the stock than on the western side of the stock. So focus in here now, for example, on areas 3B and 3A. In 3B, we estimate that 12.1% of the biomass is currently in area 3B and exactly a third of the biomass in 3A. If we then turn this into the catch by applying those harvest rate targets, we end up with a lower fraction in 3B, 9.9%, and a higher fraction in 3A because we're applying a higher harvest rate on the eastern side of the stock. And that's why we're not apportioning the catch. We're apportioning the biomass estimates and then applying the harvest policy to get the catch levels. Just trying to build to how we generate these catch tables that I'm about to show you. Okay, so once we've calculated those distributions, we can then compare the distributions of any set of catch levels to the harvest rate target. For example, these are the catch limits that were adopted for 2014 relative to the distribution suggested from apportionment. And as you can see here, the actual adopted catch limits in 2014 were somewhat in excess of the harvest policy at the extreme ends of the stock in area 2A and 2B and 4B and 4CDE, and consistently just slightly below the harvest rate target across the middle of the stock from 2C to 4A. That's the distribution of the stock. We can also compare to the absolute magnitude of harvest. So here, now we're comparing the rate relative to the target, which is labeled here the blue line across the middle, and the bars represent the realized harvest rate hindcast. This is not the value that the Commission had in front of them when they set the catch limits. It's now looking back in 2020 hindsight at what we think that harvest corresponded to in terms of a harvest rate. And what you can see here is that starting in the early 2000s, we estimate that the harvest rate was in excess of the harvest rate target. And beginning in 2010, began to be reduced as the Commission reduced the annual harvest levels. Now the two bars there in 2013 and 2014 also have a little dash in the middle of them, and that dash represents the target that we projected at the time those catch limits were adopted. We projected that's what the harvest rate would be. And you'll note that the gray bars are higher than those two dashes in both 2013 and 2014. And what that tells us is that although we made the best projection we could about what removals were going to result from the harvest levels that were adopted, in both cases, the actual harvest came out to be a little bit higher. The rate turned out to be a little bit higher than we thought at the time. And that'll be relevant as we move through some additional information that I'll show you with regard to making projections for the upcoming year in this stock. Okay, that gets us to how we generate the catch tables. So to generate the catch tables, apply both the harvest policy, both targets, the distribution and the scale, to generate the target level of removals. And that's what we're calling the blue line. Again, if you've been involved in this process for a long time, you'll remember that in previous years, prior to the 2013 annual meeting, the staff presented staff catch advice. And that was just one set of numbers. That's the application of the harvest policy, and here's the staff catch advice for harvest levels. Starting in the 2013 annual meeting, and now this is the third year that we've operated this way, we're not just presenting a single set of numbers. We're presenting the full decision table so that everybody here can evaluate the trade-offs, the risks and the benefits to a given level of harvest. But the blue line represents that point of continuity. So you can also look at the blue line and say, okay, well, this is where the staff catch advice would have been in previous years, and this is how alternate levels above and below that compare. Remember, what we're doing here is creating catch tables from our best estimate of the stock, from the point estimates. And I've just spent quite a long time explaining to you how much uncertainty there is in our current stock estimates. We currently don't have a good way to roll that into these catch tables. But you should remember that as you look at these catch tables, that there is a substantial amount of uncertainty in the inputs to these tables. In order to project the removals, what we're talking about here now is catch tables for 2015. So in order to project these removals, I can calculate at the blue line the TCEYs based on the current stock size and the distribution. I can apply the various catch sharing plans in different areas to estimate how the removals are likely to be distributed. And then in some cases, we're forced to use the 2014 estimates of removals, for example, for bycatch, to project what might occur in 2015. I'll get back and talk quite a bit more about that at the end of this presentation, but I just want to be clear how we're making these projections. Okay, the other change this year is that the catch table used to be fairly concise. You used to see a few rows, and these are the rows that are not sort of blacked out on this one. You saw the non-FCEY removals. In the past, this was called other removals. You'd see the FCEY row, and you'd see the TCEY row, and then that was about it. You'd see the percentages from apportionment, but that's about all the resolution you could get. And in response to the Commissioner's request at the last annual meeting for a more full accounting of all sizes and sources of mortality to this stock, the first step toward that is to show everybody all the various sources of removals. I remind you that this is going to be a really complicated table when I pull off all these panels over it, and you don't necessarily need, if you're not interested in the detail of what makes up the FCEY or what makes up the other removals, you don't need to look at all those other rows. The same totals are there that were in the previous year's tables, but there's some additional information here. So for example, in the other removals, you can now see the breakout of where we're getting all these other sources of removals, from commercial wastage, this is removals that are over 26 inches in length, from bycatch, from sport plus wastage, as Heather pointed out, we're including discard mortality in the sport fisheries as well this year, as well as personal and subsistence harvest. Note that this table is pretty messy up there. There's some NAs and there's some different values, and depending on which catch sharing plan you're in, different pieces of this are inside or outside the fishery CEY. Again, if this is too much information, you don't need to focus in here, but if this is in your regulatory area, you may be interested in the distribution of these removals inside and outside the fishery CEY. Next block here is within the fishery CEY itself. And here you can see, again, depending on the catch sharing plan, commercial wastage, some parts of the sport removals, personal use and subsistence, and the commercial landings are involved in the total fishery CEY. And I know this was a point of some confusion last year because the change in the catch sharing plan in Area 2C and Area 3A moved commercial wastage and some of the sport removals into the fishery CEY. And I know we got a lot of questions and a lot of feedback. Well, it wasn't entirely clear perhaps in my presentation last year that the fishery CEY wasn't just the commercial landings in Area 2C and 3A. It also included the recreational removals. It was footnoted in those tables, but maybe it wasn't that obvious. So what we've done is to bring everything in line. So you can now see the various sources of removals in each of these pieces. Now, perhaps the most important step forward in terms of accounting for all sources of removals is this bottom part, which was not previously included in these tables. And that's the removal of halibut that are less than 26 inches in length. So if you went to last year's catch tables or catch tables from the previous years, you couldn't add up to the bottom and actually figure out what the total mortality on the stock was. But now you can, because now we've got the U26 removals there as well. Now you can see that there's removals from commercial wastage, not a lot, but a little bit of removals of U26 from commercial wastage, and a substantial amount of bycatch removals that are less than 26 inches in length. And at the end of the day, we're looking at about another 3 million pounds of removals that weren't really visible in the previous catch table. So I think this is a step forward in terms of just accounting for all the various sources of removals, just to show you everything in one table. Unfortunately, it makes for a really big table. I could barely fit it on one PowerPoint slide. So I'm also going to show you a couple of summary tables that cook down kind of the salient rows out of here. But the point being, for the various alternative rows in the decision table, you can go into the Blue Book in the Harvest Policy section and find a full catch table associated with what we would project each of these various sources of removals to be in the upcoming year. Importantly, you can now add up the major subtotals here and get to the total mortality on the stock. And I think that's really what the first step toward full accounting for all sizes and sources of removals is just being able to add it all up and see what are we talking about. For a given level of fishery CEYs and a given alternative, where are we going to end up in terms of total mortality from this stock? Okay, well that was what we adopted in 2014, but it turned out after the end of the year, some of these numbers were revised substantially, and I've just highlighted a few of the bigger ones here, but the revisions were substantially higher for some of the bycatch estimates, particularly in Area 4C, D, and E, and as Heather presented to you earlier this afternoon, the sport removals in 3A, also in 2C, but 3A was a greater amount, were actually substantially above what we projected based on the catch sharing plan. In aggregate, what this means is that instead of having 39.5 million pounds of removals, roughly, we ended up with more like 42.5 million pounds of removals. And if you remember back a couple slides ago, that's why the bar for the adopted harvest rate, the projection that we thought we were going to hit, was actually a little lower than what we've realized in hindsight, because the actual removals have played out in several cases to be pretty substantially larger than we projected. And again, we're trying to project what the removals are going to be next year, and that's a difficult proposition, and we need to remember that as we start looking at these catch tables, that they are projections about what's going to happen in the upcoming year. And in the last couple of years, we've been under both times, in 13 and 14. So the next thing I want to present to you is, well, what if we just adopted the same fishery CEYs that we had this year in 2014? How would that play out? Because our estimates of the stock have changed a little bit, the stock distribution, and some of these other sources of removals have changed a little bit. So if we look at the status quo FCEYs, push forward to 2015, the distribution relative to the harvest policy would be somewhat different than we saw in 2014. You see in some areas it would be in excess of the harvest policy target, and in other areas it would be quite a bit lower, but it wouldn't be exactly the same as it was last year because our stock estimates have changed and the other removals have changed as well. So just setting the same fishery CEYs 2 years in a row is not necessarily going to realize the same amount of harvest area to area and achieve the same distribution. I think that's an important point to remember. There's a lot of moving parts here, and the fishery CEY is only one of them. How would the 2014 fishery CEYs compare to where we've been for the last couple of years? Well, we would project that they would be actually somewhat lower than what we realized for last year, and perhaps even slightly lower than what we were projecting for last year. And I'll show you the catch table associated with that. The reason why, part of the reason why, is that that's the total removals. We would be projecting the catch sharing plan, the recreational removals in Area 2C and 3A, based on the council action that was taken in December. We would be projecting that those would be back closer to the catch sharing plan targets rather than above as they were in 2014. So some of these reductions that we'd see are based on projecting the results of management action that's, in this case, already been taken by the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. Okay, that brings us to the 2015 blue line, where we apply the current harvest policy and calculate the distribution of the TCEYs and then find the fishery CEYs that get us those TCEYs. And what we project for the 2015 blue line is a total mortality level of just under 39 million pounds. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all of these numbers here, but I do want to point out one number that's already generated a fair bit of discussion, which is the fishery CEY in Area 4 C, D, and E. When we made these projections in October, we projected that the fishery CEY in Area 4 C, D, and E would be 370,000 pounds based on some increases in our estimates of bycatch through the end of October, leading to a total mortality still in excess of 5 million pounds. I'm going to come back to this and show you an updated table at the end of this talk reflecting some newer information, but this is where we were at the interim meeting. And again, this is just one projection of where we might be in 2015. Now, I know there's a lot of numbers in this table, so I'm going to cook this down to just a couple of the rows. I'm going to start by comparing the TCEY. The TCEY from the 2014 blue line on the top row here to the 2014 adopted catch levels and the 2015 blue line. And so what you can see primarily here is the change in our perception of how the stock is distributed and how big that stock is. So I'll point out a couple things. There are actually 5 regulatory areas that have an increased TCEY relative to the 2014 blue line. What this means is that we estimate that there's more yield available than we did last year in 5 of the regulatory areas, and including a slightly larger amount of yield at the coast-wide level. This, going back to my first slide, this is where I think there's a little bit of sign for optimism here. This is actually the first time that we've seen several areas showing signs of more yield available this year than the year before. But that's relative to the blue line from last year. If we compare to the adopted catch limits from last year, there are only 3 regulatory areas that are in excess of the adopted catch limits last year. Areas 2C, 3A, and 4A all have larger TCEY values estimated for 2015 than are comparable with the adopted catch limits from 2014. So that's the TCEY. Now the TCEY doesn't quite get us to the fishery CEY. To get to the fishery CEY, we have to account for what's happened to all those other sources of removals. So now if I move to comparison of the fishery CEY, this is reflecting not only the change in the yield available, but also the change in the other sources of removals. And I want to point out a couple things here. There are still 4 areas that are projected to have a larger fishery CEY in 2015 than we estimated for the blue line in 2014. Those are 2A, 2C, 3A, 4A, and then at the total as well. If we compare to the adopted catch limits in 2014, there are only 3 areas, again, the same 3 areas that are slightly higher fishery CEY at the blue line in 2015 than were associated with the adopted catch limits in 2014. I want to take a second here to point out that the blue line in 2014 for Area 4 C, D, and E was only 640,000 pounds. It was actually quite low last year as well, even relative to the discussion that we've been having this year. And I'm going to show you a couple more tables on there. But I want to point out that the low fishery CEY in 4 C, D, and E was not a new thing this year. It was in the results last year as well. Okay, so that was the results we had through the end of October when we produced the stock assessment, we produced the first set of results, and through the interim meeting. Now we understand that this is a live process. We're doing a real-time assessment. We're using the data available from the current year, and we're moving right into the process of setting catch limits this week by the end of the week. And as I've done for the past couple of years, I fully expect to produce new alternatives and new scenarios and new catch tables as the decision-making process unfolds. That's my job, to keep the decision-making process informed and to provide the various scenarios and alternatives so that everybody can evaluate the trade-off, the risks and benefits, and how all the numbers play out under different scenarios. And in fact, at the interim meeting, our commissioners asked the staff to come up with some additional information. And this was to work with NMF staff to evaluate our estimates of 2014 bycatch. There were some questions, some surprises at the interim meeting, some values that didn't seem consistent with some published values, and our commissioners asked us to look a little deeper into this and come up with some revised estimates and really make sure that we were confident about these estimates coming into the annual meeting. The bottom line is we needed to make sure we had the best estimates possible for the decision-making process at this meeting. And so that's what we've done. So the first thing we did, we worked with our colleagues at the North Pacific Observer Program and the NIMS Regional Office, and in collaboration we found that the methods that we've been using were actually fine, but in the process we realized that due to the fishing season in 2014, there have been some differences in the tail end of the season from previous years. And so what I'm going to present to you now are the post-season estimates of bycatch. So this is now that the 2014 is over, these are our best estimates of bycatch currently available. And this is just to show you, in total, those summed up to 9 million pounds across all regulatory areas for 2014. And this gives you a sense of the distribution of bycatch across those areas. You can see that Area 4, C, D, and E comprises just over half of the total bycatch coastwide. Area 4 is closer to 2/3 of the total bycatch, and areas 3 and 4 comprise virtually all of the bycatch at a coastwide level. The estimate, this updated estimate of 9 million pounds, is 3% lower than the estimates that I showed you earlier in the first couple of slides. So it was actually not a huge change, even when we get the final postseason estimates. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that process of updating those estimates in a second. First, I want to zoom in here on Area 4, C, D, and E, because that's where we've had the most questions about the bycatch levels. So now zooming in on Area 4, and 4A, 4B, and 4C, D, and E. This breaks out these updated bycatch estimates by each of those regulatory areas, and also shows you the total there in the kind of purplish color. The tallest bars are the total. What you can see there is that for all the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, or Area 4, the total bycatch has been up and down, but actually fairly consistent over the last 5 years. There really hasn't been much of a directional change. For the last 2 years, from 2012 was actually the highest value in this series, we've seen a decrease to 2013 and another small decrease to 2014 for all of Area 4. Now, the bycatch is managed via PSC limits for the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, which is essentially all of Area 4. But the IPHC sets catch limits by each of these, by Area 4A, 4B, and 4CDE. So inside that larger story, each of these IPHC areas is now relevant to the fishery CEYs. And what you can see when you look at the green bars, for example, Area 4, C, D, and E, is that even though the total amount of bycatch has gone down slightly in the last couple of years, actually the bycatch in Area 4, CDE has been going up since 2011, consistently each year. That's been partially offset by decreases in Area 4A and 4B that have actually brought the total down. But in Area 4, C, D, and E, the bycatch has been increasing since 2011. And again, these are the updated bycatch estimates from after the end of the calendar year. They may be adjusted for data quality at some point in the future, but these are pretty close to final values. If we look at the trends, the 5-year trends over all the regulatory areas, again, I've just shown you these trends for 4C, D, and E, 4B, and 4A. These are not on the same scale. Remember back to that pie chart. Area 2 has much smaller levels of bycatch than Area 3 and so on to Area 4. But just to give you a sense of how bycatch has been trending in these areas, you can see that 4B and 4A have been coming down for a couple of years. 3B and 3A, well, up or down slightly, a mixed bag there. 2C has been coming down, although 2C's contribution to the coastwide total is extremely small. So this just gives you a sense of with the updated estimates of how bycatch has been trending in each of the regulatory areas within that pie chart, remembering that each of these represents a much smaller, a much different size of the pie, slice of pie than others. Okay, last little bit here about projections and estimates, because this is the point. What I've been talking about is updated bycatch estimates for 2014. But what we're really interested in is what's going to happen to the bycatch in 2015. And the reason the 2014 values are relevant is because the method that the IPHC has used to project the upcoming year's bycatch is to project last year's bycatch. It's been a pretty good estimate of what's going to happen next year is what happened last year. We've seen some long-term trends in bycatch, but that's the estimate that we've been using. So there are 3 kinds of estimates we've got here. We've got the pre-season estimate, which is what we project for the upcoming year, like 2015 right now. We don't know what it's going to be yet. We've got the in-season estimate that we make at the time we have to do the stock assessment. So we need to finalize these data at the end of October. but there's still fishing going on in November and December, so we project those last 2 months of the year. That's our in-season estimate. And then we have a postseason estimate. And usually we don't get the postseason estimate until the next year's assessment. This year we actually have a postseason estimate available, so I can show you how that would look. But I want to look back through to 2013 and see what this would have looked like in Area 4 C, D, and E. So starting from the left here, this is bycatch mortality in millions of pounds in Area 4 C, D, and E in 2013. You can see that our preseason estimate of bycatch was a little over 3.5 million pounds. When we updated that with an in-season estimate through the end of October, we got a value that was almost exactly the same. Not quite. It looks the same in this plot, but it's actually not the same value quite. But then after the year was over, we discovered postseason that it was actually quite a bit higher than we had projected. That was 2013. In fact, it was about 650,000 pounds higher than the projection that we made. And again, that's partly why the realized harvest rate turned out to be a little higher than we projected for 2013. If we now move to 2014, our preseason estimate of 2014, sitting at this annual meeting last year, was the in-season estimate from 2013, because that's all we had available at the time. Note that that was updated to a substantially higher number as an in-season estimate this October, and that's what I presented to you at the interim meeting. We found that there'd been quite a lot more fishing during the year than we projected from 2013. And then now we have these postseason estimates, which turned out to be about 250,000 pounds less in Area 4 C, D, and E than our in-season estimate. So now that the year is over, and thanks to help from the Observer Program and the NMFS Regional Office, we now have these updated estimates. And so with that, I can now calculate an updated catch table for 2015, which shows you the results projecting forward now, importantly, projecting forward that 2014 value that's been updated to 2015. And we updated the bycatch in all of the regulatory areas in Alaska. However, in no case was it larger, the change larger than about 40,000 pounds anywhere in the table, except in Area 4 C, D, and E, where now instead of 370,000 pounds fishery CEY, it's 520,000 pounds fishery CEY. But again, all I'm doing here is projecting the 2014 bycatch estimate next year. The question really is, what is a good estimate of bycatch for 2015? What is likely to happen in 2015? And how might that influence this table? And with that, I think I'll take some questions. Thank you.
All right. Excuse me. Thanks very much, Ian. So were there any questions online, Steve? No? And what about in the room? Did people sign up?
I have some questions if no one else has any.
Okay. All right. Excuse me, Bruce was just suggesting another option too is to go through the regulatory proposals. There's a number of those. Won't take us too long to go through them, and then we'll come back to the questions. Thanks very much, Ian.
Good afternoon. Well, we're almost done the presentations. This one will be short. These are the regulation proposals from the staff and different agencies. First of all, the staff is recommending for the commercial fishery March 15th to November 7th, and this is for the quota share fisheries. When we do this, we look at we're looking at the migration of the fish, as well as the market. So we think that March 15th to November 7th would be a good date for the quota share fisheries. Recognizing for Area 2A, all of the commercial fisheries would fall within this series. The Area 2A directed fishery, which is the series of 10-hour openings, they usually occur every 2 weeks. And the first one would be, the staff recommends June 24th. We, a couple of years ago, did a survey of the 2A participants, and they recommended starting late in June, and they go on a Wednesday for market reasons, and they go every 2 weeks until the season. Well, we set I think it's 6 or 7 days out. The staff would recommend endorsing the catch sharing plans for 2A, the ones for 2C and 3A, and for CD and E, and also endorsing the allocation by Department of Fisheries and Oceans. This is a regulation proposal that was brought forth by the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. As you know, there's an allocation program for the sport fishery, and the council asked the Halibut Commission staff to put in regulations that manage the sport charter fisheries. And these, the information comes from ADF&G. It's presented to a sport advisory group at the council, and then the council has recommended this to the Halibut Commission. It's easier for IPHC to adopt these regulations, and this is why they're asking us to adopt them. For Area 2C, it would be a 1 fish daily bag limit for the charter fishery with a reverse slot limit where the fish would need to be 40 inches, equal to 40 inches or less, or greater than 80 inches or above, and that's for the head off length. This recommendation is for the blue line. If the Commission chose to pick a catch limit that was higher than the blue line, then the Council recommends that the lower level be increased. For Area 3A, they recommend that there be a 2 fish daily bag limit where there would be a maximum size of 29 inches or greater for the second fish. There would also be an annual limit of 5 fish. This is something new. In addition, a vessel would be restricted to 1 fish per calendar day. That's similar to last year. And lastly, as we noted earlier, the harvest was over the allocation. So the recommendation that there won't be any charter fishing on Thursdays between June 15th and August 31st. And if you note in the blue book, we actually have August 15th, but the date that's being recommended is August 31st. Lastly, if the Commission adopted a blue line that was higher than or adopted a catch limit that was higher than the blue line, then the recommendation is to increase the maximum size of the second fish. So these are recommendations from the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council to the IPHC. This is a recommendation from NIMPS, and this one's in the blue book as well. The North Pacific Fisheries Management Council has changed their definition of sport guide fishing. It now is in line with ADF&G regulations, and so they're recommending that the Commission endorse or accept this recommendation or this regulation so that our regulations are the same definition for the guided fishing. And it is that the guide does not need to be aboard. Guided fishing would be if there was assistance from a person was compensated, the guide was compensated, but they wouldn't actually have to be on the same vessel. Lastly, these are not in the blue book, and I'm sure NIMPS staff can explain them. They've written a letter to the Commission to make 3 other changes, and this is to bring IPHC regulations to mirror IPHC and NIMPS regulations would be mirrored. The first one actually is IPHC regulations currently say for the charter fisheries in 2C and 3A that if fish is filleted, then the carcass needs to remain on board so that the enforcement can tell the size of fish. NIMPS is putting this in their management measures, so IPHC does not need to put them in their regulations. So they could remove that if they wanted to. If the Commission chose not to, the regulations would still be the same. NIMPS is recommending that we clarify that the guide is responsible for the angler. This is in for 2C and 3A for the guide, the sport fishing. If there is a guide, if the guide is not on the vessel, then they are still responsible for the angler's action. And lastly, for the same areas, that the halibut needs to be retained on the vessel until the end of the charter trip. And so these are not in the blue book, but we can make sure that during PAG or the conference board, if you need some more clarification, that NIMS or IPHC staff can come and clarify that. Lastly, there's been a proposal to add California Fish and Wildlife officers to the definition of authorized officers in IPHC regs, and these people are able to enforce IPHC regulations. Oregon State, Oregon, Washington, ADF, and G are all authorized officers, and so with the new California fishery, we're just recommending that California Fish and Wildlife be added. And lastly, I'm not going to go over the industry proposals or the catch limit proposals, but if you look in the blue book on page 225, there is additional proposals that you should look at when you're discussing regulation proposals in the conference board and PAG. That's it.
All right, thanks very much, Heather. There are 3 people that did put down their names for some questions. In order, it's Roy Manning, Simon Swetzoff, and Leonard Harvey, I believe, are the 3 people. And there's a microphone over there in the middle of the room. If you would each go up and announce your name and then your question.
Say, my name's Roy Manning, and some of the things I'm not is not a biologist, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a numbers person. I don't like to throw mud at other people that are other gear types or anything, but I am a commercial fisherman in Canada. I fished up to 400,000 pounds of quota in 1 year. We're down to about 180. I've never been involved in a fishery that's been so clean on our coast. I mean, we're policed more than a villain is nowadays. We got cameras, we got everything else. I mean, you just can't do it any cleaner than we do it. And I hear talk of our quota being cut again. And that's why I came to the meeting. I can't understand it even after listening to everybody speak. And that's about all I had to say.
Thanks very much, Roy. You're for Fish in BC in Area 2B, I believe. Up next is Simone or Simon. I'm sure I got your name wrong.
Yeah, it's fine. I'm used to being butchered. I appreciate it. My name is Simeon Swetzoff, Jr. I just got a couple of comments, if I may, Mr. Chairman, that because I don't know if I'll have an opportunity to speak to you guys like you are today, right here, right now, and then have everybody in the room here like we are today understand the situation that we are in. And my name is Simeon Swetzoff, Jr. I'm the mayor for the city of St. Paul, and I'm also the tribal representative for St. Paul Island on halibut. And as you know, I'm fishing out of St. Paul Island for quite a while now, and 4C-D&E is my area, well, from St. Paul 4C. But everybody in here, I believe, understands the situation that 4C-D&E is in. And I appreciate the North Pacific Fishery Management Council coming in, being able to attend, those of them that could today, to listen to what's happening here at the Halibut Commission meeting, because the bycatch issue is going to be on the agenda at the council meeting also, and I really appreciate that. So from the Pribilof Islands perspective, or from St. Paul's, you know, we have just so everybody knows, we've made comments to the commission for their packets and the reasons for us being here on dealing with what's happening to us out in 4C-D&E. We've also we're thankful enough for the Alaskan North Pacific Fishery Management Council members to write letters to the Secretary of Commerce in Washington, D.C. on 4C-D&E's behalf, and I really appreciate that. I couldn't be more appreciative. And our tribal government in St. Paul, we were able to have a government-to-government consultation with NOAA and National Marine Fisheries Service, with the Secretary of Commerce's office, in regards to what's happening to Area 4C-D&E with our halibut issue, and our tribal government working with the United States government on dealing with this here and trying to resolve exactly what is happening up there. And so, and then we were able to get a letter from the secretary, or from Elaine Sobek, giving her comments. And I don't know if the people in Canada, if your citizens have a government-to-government consultation with the Canadian government, but we are able to have that, and that's a fantastic thing because we can raise our point to the Congress of the United States if it has to, the President. You know, it can go that high. And I appreciate that as a U.S. citizen. And I'm really hoping that what we've been arguing here in regards to the bycatch issue that's going to be talked about so much right now, and I'm really thankful about that because I'm a halibut fisherman and a subsistence fisherman myself, that I would like to have it go instead of what's being said here in regards to the numbers on the 500,000 pounds, and I appreciate the Halibut Commission staff for the science that they put on the table. But the rest of the U.S. fishing industry is in this room too. The trawlers are here. The factory longliners are here too. I know they're here. I know them myself. And so we only have a small pie of fish to talk about here and divvy up amongst ourselves. And I want us to be able to talk to these guys about, you know, let's move some of that bycatch over to the directed fishery so we can continue to have a fishery. And so that, you know, what's happening with the gentleman that was up there giving his presentation, you know, talking about not knowing what's going to happen next year. Well, no, I don't think any of us do, but one way to help us stay afloat in this, to continue to participate in the fisheries like we do, like we think we do, need to, that would be that the 1.285 should be the bottom of the barrel for us. And that's it, you know, and I can't help but relay and say it again and again, and I'm hoping that we get you guys' support on dealing with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for making that presentation, and I'm sure we'll be back discussing that some more over the course of the next 4 days. There's one more person there, Leonard.
Yeah, Lenny Herzog, representing 4CD concerned fishermen. So the people that I represent are skippers and people that are fishing up there, not the local native community. I wanted, basically the question was, you know, when the last speakers talked about what the bycatch levels is, I think you're hearing from the North Pacific Management Council and from, I call them the bycatch users, you know, from the people that are using the bycatch, that they're going to take every effort they can, humanly possible, to reduce bycatch voluntarily next year until the council can catch up with them. So I hope that this board can take them at face, even though I believe that we should be imposing, you know, mandatory caps and keep the 4CD level at 1.28. And then you'll have another year next year to come back and see if the U.S. industry did what they did, and if our efforts at the council, where we spoke vehemently last month and will again next month, come to fruition. The 4CD area is 55% of the area that we fish halibut. It contains about a third of the biomass by weight. All the indications are that we saw an increase in your setline survey. We saw an increase in the WPUE from the commercial side. And I don't think that if we appropriate 700,000 more pounds to 4CD&E, that it's going to be a long-lasting damaging effect, you know, to the conservation of the areas. And also, it's kind of hard to understand, but what happened was 026 bycatch comes directly out of Area 4CD&E. It's not distributed to the Canadians, and it's not distributed to the other areas in the United States. So what happened, in effect, is last year the bycatch was under 26, and so everybody took a hit, and everybody's area took a little bit of hit. This year, because the bycatch, I think because there's a good age year class of 8-year-old fish coming in, because the bycatch affected over 26-inch fish, almost the entire pain comes to 4CD&E. So basically, we're just asking for one more year to take another look at it. Hopefully, what we're seeing in the setline surveys and our commercial catches will continue and to improve. And although we have real problems with bycatch, we can give our industry, you know, the chances to voluntarily move or to move under some real restrictive campaign that our council enforces. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Leonard. So that was the list. There will be more opportunities to ask questions. I'll just see if there's any questions from any of the commissioners. Don?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a couple questions of Heather on the regulatory proposals for clarification. I guess my first question is that on the regulatory proposals, the comment about the fillet, not the regulation for requiring, let's see if I can find it here. Under NIMS regulations are required that a fish is filleted on board and the carcass must be retained until fillets are offloaded. IPHC regulations therefore do not need to retain this stipulation. I'm wondering, is that regulation still going to, if we approve this, is that regulation still going to be printed in the IPHC regulation manual? We get the booklet that lays out the regulations. Is that still going to continue to be listed? Or will they have to go someplace else to find another reference?
If you take action to take that out of IPHC regulations, it would not be printed in our booklet. If you do nothing, then the regulation stands and it would be printed in our booklet.
Yep, go ahead, Don.
And then another question on the charter management measures for Heather. And maybe you don't have the answer for this, and maybe NIMS might be able to provide clarification, is that both management measures that were offered here assume that, as far as I can tell, is that we're going to adopt the blue line, which is a little bit higher than the catch limit in 2014. The blue line's higher, 2C and 3A, a little bit, and that if we went higher than the blue line, there would be room for an adjustment. I'm wondering, in past Halibut Commission deliberations, there used to be the rule of fast down and slow up. So if we chose a catch measure less than the blue line, chose not to take the full increase, do you know if those management measures would have to be revisited and what that might be?
If you adopted a catch limit that was less than the blue line, I was at the council meeting and there was no discussion about what would happen then. I mean, you could assume that maybe they want to do the same with what they've said. If you, for area 2C, you would increase the size of the smaller fish, but I'm not. ADF&G is here, and I don't know if they have anything to add. No, Scott's shaking his head. That was not discussed at the council meeting. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer.
Okay, thank you for that.
Bob, you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of questions. The first one deals with Area 3B and apportionment. And the proposed blue line suggests a down there on the harvest from last year. And when I queried the staff a couple of weeks ago, I got the sense that that was driven by some bycatch numbers and apportionment. And on the apportionment level, is 3B being disadvantaged by, for instance, 4A's expansion of our survey? Why is, I guess the question is, how is the apportionment number in 3B getting squeezed? And I noticed the numbers are generally up on the survey in 3B. No, were they? I got my areas.
Okay, I'll take that question in two parts. I don't know if I can go back through. Yes, I can go back through the slides. I think perhaps this is a good slide to start on. I'll take the second part of your question first. Maybe it was the first part. In 3B, the bycatch estimate did go up slightly from 2013 to 2014. So if we project that to 2015, that is a small reduction in the amount of fishery CEY. If I go back to this figure, this shows you the TCEY compared for the 2014 blue line to the 2015 blue line. And you are correct, the amount of yield that we're estimating from area 3B is slightly lower in 2015 than from 2014. And so that would be a result of apportionment. And the apportionment, as I pointed out back in this early slide, pardon me, here we go. There are several things factoring into apportionment, and I'm not sure, Ray may be able to comment on this, whether the timing and hook competition corrections, how those played out for Area 3B in 2015. But you are right to point out that if one area is estimated to have a larger fraction of the coastwide stock, there's only 100% to go around, and so there is some recalibration of all the apportionment estimates. The expansion in Area 4A did indicate that there are more fish in deeper water than we had previously understood, and therefore there's a larger fraction estimated, a larger fraction of the total coastwide stock estimated to occur in Area 4A. And so some of that would be realized in lower apportionment estimates across other regulatory areas. But that's just an improvement in our understanding of how the stock is currently distributed. We didn't know that those fish were there in deeper water, or didn't know in the context of apportionment in the past.
Last question, Mr. Chair. On 4 Bravo, I understand there's the survey was down, but the commercial numbers were double-digit, 20 or 30% up. And I understand the survey basically has eastern and western area, ATU and ADAC. And ADAC was slightly up. Has the staff been able to reconcile the big difference between the commercial? Are they fishing earlier than the survey, later than the survey, different areas than the survey?
So, yes, the commercial fishery weight per unit effort was up in 4B, 4 Bravo, in 2014. The setline survey, I believe, was down slightly. And when we looked at we did look at the spatial breakout of the setline survey, and you're correct in stating that the more easterly area had only slightly lower catch rates than the year before, but the far western area had substantially lower catch rates than we'd seen in 2013. I think I'd like to point out that Area 4B is an area we have prioritized for 2017, I believe, for our setline survey, but it is also a high priority area to revisit because the patchiness of our survey in that area is substantial. There's a significant portion on Bowers Ridge to the north of Area 4B, and in the far western islands. There are a lot of stations that fall within the depth zone of our survey, but we're not currently sampling. It's spatially, there's a lot of gaps in that part of the survey. And I think what we learned in Area 4A this year is that some of those gaps in the Aleutians may actually have a substantial number of fish in them. So, you know, we're trying to prioritize based on the areas that have the most likely, the largest likely changes to our understanding of how the stock is distributed. But there's some substantial uncertainty there in 4B, and I think that's probably is contributing to the difference between the fishery and the survey.
All right, thanks, Bob. I did, just before, see if any other commissioners have a question, I did see a gentleman in the audience that wanted to ask a question, at least one, so I was going to go back to the audience at large, but are there any other questions from the commissioners? Is there any online at all, Steve? So let's go back to the audience and see if there's additional questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is John Crowley. I own together with my son-in-law, we own a 69-foot longliner out of Seattle. And I'd like to mention to you that whatever the season openings and closures are and the quotas are, I can live with that. What I can no longer hardly live with is the bycatch issue, and certainly it's already been mentioned a number of times, but it needs to be addressed, and I would like to ask this body, this esteemed members up here, and it is a privilege and a pleasure to be able to address and talk to you. I would like to ask you to work with the North Pacific Council, National Marine Fisheries, and the state of Alaska to reduce this bycatch issue. I believe that there are at least 4 areas that could be very conducive and helpful to the halibut fishery. One would be to address the 32-inch to 30-inch size fish, which would save something on the order of between 800,000 and 1 million pounds of fish. Another one would be to speed up this deck sorting on the trawl fleet. We understand that a substantial savings could be made if we get this deck sorting going on the trawl fleet. And one that's not so popular with possibly the trawl fleet and maybe others would be the closure, or at least partial closure, of the nursery ground. As halibut fishermen in the Bering Sea, we have not been in the nursery ground since the 1940s. That's before I was born. And yet the trawl fleet gets to trawl right through the center of it and take whatever they like. That is detrimental and deadly to halibut. It's probably the single biggest issue. And then if you go through all 3 of those things and you manage to save this halibut, we have another issue in the Gulf of Alaska that goes back to bycatch too, and that is we don't know what's going on in the Gulf of Alaska. Unfortunately, as an industry in Alaska, we were sold what seemed to be a good idea, this restructuring of the observer program so far, and frankly, I have to hold National Marine Fisheries their feet to the fire on this one. It has not been a good program so far. On our vessel, the last 2 years, we've had 50% coverage. That's half of our trips each year were covered. And I don't care. We don't have anything to hide. We don't have any problems up there. They could put an observer on me 100% of the time, and it's fine. That's not the issue. The trawl fleet is the issue. They're not being observed. The facts last year showed that they were covered about a little over 9%. And when you pull out this issue of tendering that many of you are aware of, it drops down to about 7%. Come on, really? Can you look me in the face and say that 7% coverage on the trawl fleet in the Gulf of Alaska is adequate to decide how much bycatch they're taking? No one really knows what they're taking in the Gulf of Alaska. That needs to be addressed. National Marine Fisheries and the Council need to clarify that. Now, it's been held out, and probably somebody will say this, well, when it gets rationalized, it'll be 100% coverage. Well, when will it be rationalized? We don't know that either, do we? That may be sometime down the road. I'm asking National Marine Fisheries to step up and to take a look at observer coverage on that trawl fleet, aside from rationalization, and get the coverage on there that's so needed. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your comments, John.
Are you taking more comments in the folks?
Yes, please go ahead.
I'd like to talk about that.
Could you speak into the microphone, please?
I'd like to talk about 100% bycatch observation in the Bering Sea. We've been told this by our commissioners for, well, I've heard it for 20 years, and 20 years ago we refused to sign the treaty, and so we didn't sign it. We went to Alaska, explained the issue. They were going to fix it. We took them at their word and signed the treaty. Okay? Here we are now in 2015. We just find out that 100% observer coverage means 26 boats were observed with 2 observers who aren't allowed in the factory. So that means they're only observing a third of the boats, and that's called 100%. Well, that doesn't go over in Canada. You couldn't even dream of doing something like that. That's about a third of the boat that the observers are on that they can even go and look at. So here we are. And our commissioners and Steve Penoyer before him, the new commissioner, we're all saying it's 100% observer coverage. Well, here we are. That's what you call it in the U.S., 100%, 26 votes. That probably amounts to, with this fellows, that probably amounts to, you add that to 7, we're probably looking about 12% or something. Anyway, that's all I got to say. I was going to save it for tomorrow, but...
Well, thanks very much, Gary. Looks like there's one other gentleman.
Rather than a question, it's more of a comment.
Could you provide your name, please?
It's Ken Wang, Canadian halibut fisherman. And I'd like to acknowledge Jim's comment at his opening comments, and how basically status quo in 2000 is not relevant today, and how things have changed even for the commission, just going to open meetings and different types of things. It's progress. And our science staff, for the presentation that they put on and how the past history relates and how now they are starting to look at continual change too. Even when it comes to the survey, which is one thing we as fishermen have always been saying, is we're catching fish here, and it looks to us like maybe some things are maybe not quite right in the science, and now we're looking at expanding survey areas to where we're actually fishing and catching fish and where they actually live, which is a positive thing in my view. But we all know that there's costs involved, and the survey takes fish out of the total stock, and how we get to a proper survey is that will relate to our stock size is very important to all of us. And the one thing that I'd like to say is that as fishermen, as Roy points out, it's a lot of numbers, and it's a lot of crunching, and it's a lot of things at times are hard for us to come to a total sense of. And I'm sure even the science staff with all those numbers sometimes scratch their heads too. But one thing is for sure, as fishermen, and what's proved out in at least the Canadian fishery, is that when we're regulated, we actually change our behaviors. When we're asked to do things voluntarily, change comes very, very slowly. And certainly we've resisted change as we've gone along, but history shows us through the numbers that science produces how that has benefited our fishery and the fishery for all of us in this room, and how the bycatch issue and those types of things have drastically come down through the change in behavior which we have had as fishermen and resisted. But that change only came about by regulation. So as you go through your deliberations this week, as commissioners, I hope that you push for the change to happen by regulation. And also in the numbers which science has produced for us, it becomes very stark where we have the gaps, be it in the sports fishery or in the commercial fishery or in other fisheries that affect the stocks of halibut. So I look forward to these meetings this year. I think it's going to be very interesting, and hopefully at the end of it we come to some positive developments for the halibut stock.
Thank you very much for your comments. I see there's one other person.
is Arnie Lee. I'm with the Fisheries Forum Association. I have a question on the apportionment for hook apportionment. I have a little bit of knowledge out of 4B. I've rolled around.
Could you speak into the microphone, please?
I said I have a little bit of history out in 4B. I've rolled around there quite a bit, and when you look at the, I'm not quite sure if we use the same hook apportionment coastwide or by area to by area. And the reason why I ask that question is there's a lot of dead zones out there because of the volcanic activity in silicon sand and that. And the farther you go to UNMAC, closer you go to UNMAC Pass, the less of a problem it is because the tides are much stronger and they've scoured out quite a bit of this. But farther out there, and then when you look on page 53 and 54 on the Blue Book, you notice that the hook apportionment is very consistent in area 4B as being a lot less than the other areas. So the question is, the main question is, are you using the same apportionment coastwide for hook apportionment, or is it by area by area?
Is that something you can address, Ian? Or Ray?
Okay, thank you for your question. The speaker is referring to the hook competition adjustment that we make to account for differences among regulatory areas and competition for baits. And area 4B is an area where there's relatively little hook competition compared to other areas. And because of that, we don't have a lot of hooks occupied relative to other areas occupied by other species. And so it historically has had a downward adjustment to account for its lack of competition relative to other areas which have more competition. That adjustment is applied consistently among regulatory areas. We're doing the same thing to each area depending on what we get back in terms of bycatch information from the survey, or hooks that are not occupied by hooks that are still occupied by baits that are available for halibut and other species to catch when they come back. So we are doing something consistent in area 4B as we are in other areas, if that's what you're asking.
That's what I'm asking, because the ground, the area under the water, just like areas above the water, there are a lot of deserts in a lot of places, and area 4B is in other areas in 4 are different than what you'll find in the Gulf too. So I just want you to be aware that when you're decreasing, you need to look into this.
Thanks, Arnie. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes, come up to the microphone, please, and state your name and comment or question or both.
Yeah, my name is Doug Maven, and I've been commercial halibut fishing in 2B now for 27 years as a skipper. And in the time that I've been fishing in the last 3 seasons, and last year in particular, I can't remember halibut fishing ever being better or easier. It's as good as it's ever been. And last year we adopted a catch limit higher than what you call the blue line recommendation. And in spite of that, our catch is still increasing, still improving. Size is good. Everything in the fishery is strong, and we're doing it now with less fishing ground than we've ever had before. We've got rockfish protected areas, marine protected areas, and we have very strict bycatch quotas on all our rockfish species that make a lot of the coast de facto rockfish protected areas, because you simply can't fish in there because of the bycatch quotas. So we're catching more on less fishing ground. And I see still this year that you're looking, the staff recommendation is for further decreases to our catch limit. And so I'm just wondering, how is it that the Commission sees things so differently from what we see on the fishing grounds?
Doug, I think you're asking why there's a difference between the set survey numbers and maybe what commercial fishermen are seeing, but I don't know if Ian wants to provide some comment on that. And you fish in 2B? I fish
in 2B, and what I'm asking is why there's a difference in what how the Commission is reading things and what their recommendations are and how we see things as fishermen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. Just a quick recap. You've made several good points. The catch per unit, the weight per unit effort in the commercial fishery has been increasing, and it's one thing that I didn't perhaps point out on the plot when I was looking at the commercial weight per unit effort, is that Area 2B has shown a very strong and consistent increase for a number of years in a row, and is in fact showing the highest commercial catch per unit effort on the coast at the moment. I could have pointed that out on that slide as we went by. The trends in the setline survey have not been quite as pronounced, and there are a number of reasons why the survey and the fishery may be diverging somewhat. The survey is on a standard fixed design, meaning we fish the same stations with the same bait in the same way every year, where the fishery has the opportunity to move and maximize areas of higher and lower catch rates. We did a little bit of looking at the catch rates in this year's 2014 commercial fishery in 2B, and there was some indication of shifts toward areas of historically higher abundance that you would see then in the fishery catch rates that you wouldn't see in the setline survey. That aside, the setline survey through apportionment provides us with a snapshot of how we see the stock distributed each year, and it's updated each year, but it's a single snapshot. It occurs generally in the middle of the summer. It gives us a sense of where those fish were over the depths that we sample at the time that we were there. But the commercial fishery is operating from March through November, through a much longer time period. And it's quite possible that there are fish, especially in certain areas, that are available to the commercial fishery that we may not see, or we may not see in that particular area during the time when we go there for the setline survey in the summer. It's the tool that we use to estimate how the stock is distributed, but it's not a perfect tool. But it's the only estimate that we can get currently of how the stock is distributed.
Thanks very much, Ian. Are there any other comments from the public or questions? Yep, come up to the microphone, please.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, my name is Henry Mitchell. I work with Coastal Villages Region Fund. We're a CDQ group in Alaska. We have a number of fishermen in the small villages on the western Bering Sea coast who fish halibut mainly out of small skiffs. And they have a number of concerns. Number one, there really hasn't been done any survey work in our area for a number of years. People in our area, for the most part, including the subsistence fishermen, say that there are more halibut and larger halibut in our area than ever before. And they have a concern that the data that you have described does not adequately indicate what is available, particularly in Area 4E. And I think it would be good, there are a number of those individuals here, for someone to explain what plans there may be to actually do a survey in that area.
Yes, I think one of the staff can address that and probably come up to the microphone and provide what the plans are.
Okay, so for 2015, we are planning to redo the calibration in the Eastern Bering Sea, and that includes some stations that are fairly close, at least within the parameters of our grid that we're able to fish, to those coastal areas that I think are being discussed. But it is a less dense survey than we're able to do elsewhere because of logistics. And our survey stops at 10 fathoms. So I have no doubt there are areas close to the shore that are shallow, that don't fall within our grid, that may be getting good catches. We are looking at where some new stations may be able to fit closer to shore that we did not fish previously, but it doesn't look like there'd be many of them. There may be an additional station around Nunivak Island, but we're looking closely at that. This may be something that, it seems like this is something that we may need to discuss further. If there was desire to deviate from the standardized type surveys that we're looking at, to perhaps do some sort of stratification to target areas that may be of concern, that's something we can discuss. It's not something we're currently planning to do, but we're open to discussion on ways we can improve the survey in any way.
Thanks very much, Ray. Are there any other comments? There will be other opportunities later in the meeting after you've had a chance to think about some of the information that you've heard today, and you've heard a lot, or we have heard a lot, and so there will be more opportunities for public comment and discussion for sure. And so with that, I would adjourn the meeting this afternoon. The Canadian delegation will get together in 15 minutes in the Shaughnessy room, and Jim, are you still planning the same for 15 minutes?
Yes, we'll start at 5 o'clock. That's 15 minutes from now, and I've forgotten what room we're in.
It's the Ambleside 1 is what I have on the agenda here.
Thank you.